You are on the Tacuba Causeway, and it is raining. Behind you, Tenochtitlan is burning at the edges, drums beating somewhere in the dark. Ahead of you, a gap in the roadway where a bridge used to be, black water moving through it, and men going into that water and not coming up. Some of them are so loaded with gold they sink like stones the moment they slip. You can hear canoes now, dozens of them, gliding out from between the houses, and the low whistle of a war captain's shell horn calling his warriors to the kill. This is the last hour of the Spaniards in the city of Mexico, the night that Mexico would remember, for 500 years, as the night they nearly won. But that night is still 2 centuries away. Let the rain settle. Let the drums fade. Go back now, further than memory, to a people who own nothing yet, no causeway, no city, no gold worth dying for, only a name, and a god, and a promise. They called themselves the Mexica, and before they were anything else, they were walkers. Their own stories placed their beginning in a place called Aztlán, a homeland whose exact location no one now can point to on a map, a place of white herons and reed-choked water somewhere to the north or west, already half legend even to the people who claim to have left it. Sometime in the 12th century, by the reckoning historians now favor, they set out, and for well over 100 years they did not stop. Generation followed generation on the road. Children were born walking and died walking, and were buried in places their parents could not have named the week before. They carried little. A bundle wrapped in cloth, carried always by a priest, never set down carelessly, never open to curious eyes. Inside it, it was said, the very presence of their god, Huitzilopochtli, hummingbird of the south, god of sun and war, who spoke to his priests in dreams and told them, always, to keep moving. Picture it slowly, the way you might picture a familiar dream. Dust on bare feet. The particular ache of a journey with no announced end. Behind them, one by one, the great cities of earlier peoples, Tula, Cholula, the ancient ruins of Teotihuacan, rose and were left behind, monuments to civilizations that had already risen and already fallen before the Mexica had built so much as a single permanent wall. They were latecomers to a land that had already decided, long before they arrived, who mattered and who did not. By the time they reached the Valley of Mexico, in or around the year 1325 as later chroniclers reckoned it, the good land was gone. But they did not tell the story that way, not to themselves, not to their children, not across the 2 centuries that followed. They told it as a fulfillment. Their priests had long carried a promise from Huitzilopochtli, passed down since the first days of the wandering, that the people would know their true home when they saw a sign impossible to mistake for anything else, an eagle, perched upon a nopal cactus, a serpent gripped and struggling in its talons. Whether the vision came to a priest named Tenoch in a dream, or whether the whole band simply came upon the sight together at the marsh's edge, the cactus rising improbably from a low outcrop of stone amid the reeds, the great bird upon it, wings still spread, the snake writhing beneath its claws, the story settled, generation after generation, into the same unshaken certainty. This was the place. The wandering, at long last, was over. It is worth resting a moment on how small that moment truly was. No temple yet. No causeway, no canals, no chinampas spreading their green fingers across the lake. Only a huddle of families with wet feet, standing on ground that barely held a person's weight, looking at a bird and a snake and a cactus and choosing, against every visible reason, to believe that this was destiny rather than desperation. Perhaps that is what survival often looks like from the inside, not triumph, but a decision to call the only door left to you a door you wanted all along. What they built first was nothing that would trouble any of the great lakeside lords watching from their palaces across the water. A shrine, low and unglamorous, walls of packed mud reinforced with woven reed, a roof of thatch that would need mending after every hard rain. Inside it, or perhaps simply before it in the open air, the bundle that had crossed a continent on a priest's back was finally set down. This was Huitzilopochtli's first house in his people's promised home, not stone, not gold, not the towering pyramid that would one day dwarf every temple the valley had ever seen, but mud and reed on ground that shifted underfoot, ground the older cities had discarded as worthless. They would call the place Tenochtitlan, by one telling, the place of the stone cactus fruit, honoring the very plant on which the eagle had stood. And they set to work at once on the one thing landless people always learn before anything else, how to make solid ground out of what everyone else has abandoned. Rafts of woven reed, weighted with mud dredged patiently from the lakebed, staked down with willow roots that would grow and lock the whole floating framework into place. Chinampas, though they had no such name for them yet, the beginning of an answer to the question every person standing on that marsh must have silently asked. How does anyone build an empire on water that will not hold still? That question would not be answered in one lifetime, or two, or three. It would take the patient accumulation of soil and stone and marriage alliances and calculated cruelty, the slow climbing from tolerated tenant to feared vassal to unrivaled master of the valley, before the mud and reed shrine gave way to a temple that scraped the sky and a city that travelers from Castile would one day compare, with disbelieving eyes, to Venice. But all empires begin somewhere smaller than anyone watching would guess. Somewhere out on that reed-choked water, in the dark, something had already been set in motion, and the lords of Culhuacan and Azcapotzalco, watching this ragged, unwanted people finally stop moving, had no way of knowing what they had just allowed to take root in their midst. Long before the reeds and the mud, before the causeways and the floating gardens, there was only the walking. Picture it, if sleep is already tugging at the edges of your thoughts, a people with no country, moving through a landscape that never once opened its arms to them. They called their beginning Aztlán, a name that means, roughly, the place of the herons, or perhaps the place of whiteness, and no one, not the finest chroniclers who later sat with these stories, not the friars who wrote them down in careful Spanish, not the modern historians who have chased its location across lakes and islands from the Gulf Coast to the deserts of the north, has ever agreed on where it lay. Some say it was an island in a lake, luminous with white herons roosting in the shallows. Some say it was little more than memory dressed up as geography, a homeland invented backward from the empire that eventually needed one. What matters, for the story you are falling into tonight, is that the Mexica themselves believed it utterly. Aztlán was real to them the way your own childhood house is real to you even now, half dissolved by time, half rebuilt by longing. From Aztlán, so the old accounts tell it, 7 tribes departed together, filing out of 7 caves in the earth, a place called Chicamostoc, the place of 7 caves, each tribe carrying its own bundle of gods, its own dialect, its own claim to greatness not yet earned. The Mexica were the last of these 7, and by every telling they were the least impressive. They had no city behind them and no city ahead. They dressed in skins when their neighbors already wore woven cotton. They ate what they could catch and gather while older, settled peoples ate what they had cultivated for generations. And they carried with them a god unlike the others, Huitzilopochtli, whose name means something like hummingbird of the south, or hummingbird on the left, a war god and sun god fused into one, restless, demanding presence, who spoke, or so the priests who bore his image on their backs insisted, through dreams, through omens, through the flight of birds. He was not a god who promised comfort. He promised movement. Every time the Mexica tried to settle, to plant their maize and let their bones rest for a season, the voice of Huitzilopochtli, delivered through his priest-bearers, told them, not here. Onward. So onward they went, for something like 200 years, a span longer than the entire history of the United States as I speak this to you now, spent walking, camping, planting a season's crop and abandoning it, burying elders along 1,000 miles of trail. Imagine the sheer accumulated fatigue of it, generation folding into generation, children born who would grow old and die still walking the road their great-grandparents had started down. Other peoples in the Valley of Mexico, the Toltecs' heirs, the lords of Culhuacan, the Tepanecs of Azcapotzalco, watched the Mexica arrive, again and again, at the edges of their territories, and treated them the way settled people usually treat those who have nothing, with suspicion, with contempt, with the casual cruelty of the secure toward the desperate. The Mexica were pushed off good land repeatedly. They were mocked for their crude dress, their foreign speech, their upstart god. At one especially bitter turn in the story, they took service under the lords of Culhuacan, the most prestigious of Toltec descendants, hoping proximity to greatness might rub off on them, only to be driven out in horror after, in an act that even by the standards of Mexica religion seems to have shocked their hosts. They were said to have sacrificed and flayed the skin of a Culhuacan princess sent to marry into their tribe, dressing a priest in her skin as an honor to a goddess. Whether the tale is precisely true or a piece of the humiliation dressed up afterward as a warning to others, it did its work. The Mexica fled again, hated now rather than merely pitied, chased out onto the marshes and reed beds that better established peoples had always considered worthless, too wet to farm, too infested with mosquitoes and water snakes to be worth claiming, the kind of ground a landlord lets the poorest tenant have because no one else wants it. And it was there, on that unwanted, unloved lake, Lake Texcoco, ringed by mountains, its waters shallow and brackish and utterly without value to the powers who already controlled its shores, that the story you heard the end of a moment ago finally happened. The priests, still carrying Huitzilopochtli's bundle after 2 centuries of promises, are said to have received the sign that God had sworn would end the wandering forever, an eagle, perched upon a nopal cactus that had itself grown improbably from a stone, wings spread to the rising sun, a serpent gripped and writhing in its talons. Look for this, the god had told them, generations before any living Mexica had been born, and when you see it, that is the place. Stop there. Build there. That is your promised home, no matter how little anyone else wants it. Whether any human being truly stood on that island in the year we now call 1325 and watched a real eagle devour a real serpent on a real cactus, no one can say with certainty. The story bears every mark of a legend shaped and reshaped by later hands, eager to give an accidental refuge the dignity of destiny. But something did happen that year, on that ground, something the archaeologists Spades and the pollen counts in the lakebed mud confirm even where the myths cannot. People who had wandered for longer than living memory finally stopped walking. They drove reed stakes into the shallows. They piled basket after basket of black lake mud onto floating rafts of woven branches until the rafts became small islands, and the small islands became a shore, and the shore became solid enough to hold a shrine no grander than a hut of mud and thatch, the first, humble version of what would become the great temple. They named the place Tenochtitlan, place of the stone cactus fruit, after the very plant the eagle was said to have chosen. No one watching from the shore that year, not the lords of Culhuacan who had cast them out, not the Tepanec rulers of Azcapotzalco who now claimed lordship over this soggy new neighbor, imagined they were watching anything but a beaten people finally running out of road. A landless tribe settling for mud because mud was all that was left to them. What none of those watching lords could have guessed, and what the wandering Mexica themselves could not yet have known, was what price this humble arrival would demand of them before it paid them back, what debts of tribute and blood and quiet, patient scheming would have to be spent before this waterlogged refuge became a throne. The years that followed that first muddy landfall were not the years of legend. They were slower than that, and harder, and if you had drifted past in a canoe you would have seen only a poor island growing poorer, reed huts crowded on reclaimed mud, canals dug by hand, chinampas built up one basket of lake-bottom silt at a time until a floating garden could hold a man's weight and a maize stalk's roots. The Mexica fished. They wove. They traded frogs and water insects and woven mats to their neighbors for what they could not grow. And they paid tribute, because Tenochtitlan sat, uninvited, in a lake that already belonged to someone else. That someone else was Azcapotzalco, seat of the Tepanec people, whose lords had watched this scrap of tribe wash up on their doorstep and decided, not unkindly, that a vassal was worth more than an enemy. So the Mexica were folded into the Tepanec order the way a poor cousin is folded into a wealthy household, given a place at the edge of the table, made to earn it every day. They paid tribute in fish and reptiles and building stone hauled from the mainland. When Azcapotzalco went to war, Mexica warriors went with it, and it was here, oddly enough, in the discomfort of serving another king's ambitions, that they learned to fight the way that would one day make their name a thing whispered with dread from the Gulf Coast to the southern highlands. A tributary people, if you let enough decades pass over them, is only ever a young empire wearing a smaller coat. It would take 100 years of that coat growing tighter before it finally split at the seams. And it split, as these things so often do, not because of some grand design laid down from the beginning, but because of a death. In the year we would number 1426, the old Tepanek lord of Azcapotzalco, the very ruler under whom Tenochtitlan had chafed and served and grown quietly strong, died in his sleep, an old man's death, gentle and unremarkable. What followed his passing was not gentle at all. His son seized the Tepanek throne through the kind of violence that leaves a ruler needing enemies destroyed rather than merely managed, and among the first things the new lord decided he could no longer tolerate was a Mexica king who had grown too comfortable, too capable, too proud. He had the Mexica ruler murdered. And in that single act of Tepanek overreach, he handed Tenochtitlan the one thing 100 years of tribute had never given it, a reason, plain and unanswerable, to stop kneeling. The throne that violence emptied was filled by a man named Itzcoatl. His name meant obsidian serpent, and if you wanted a single word for what he brought to the Mexica people at their most dangerous hour, cold-bladed patience would do well enough. Itzcoatl was no dreamer. He was, by most accounts, a son of a Mexican noble and a woman of common lakeshore stock, not a purebred prince by the old reckoning, and perhaps for that very reason a man who understood that greatness in this valley was not inherited so much as it was seized and then, carefully, rewritten into inheritance afterward. Beside him stood a nephew, a strategist and statesman named Tlatoani, who would spend the better part of his long life as the mind behind other men's thrones, refusing the crown himself again and again while shaping, more than any king, what the Mexica people would become. Between the two of them, one wielding the authority of rulership, the other the patient architecture of policy, the Mexica made their decision. Rather than wait to be crushed piecemeal for their new king's murder, they would strike at Azcapotzalco itself. They did not do it alone, and this, perhaps, is the part worth lingering on, because empires are rarely built by a single people acting in isolation, however the songs later tell it. Tenochtitlan found its allies where old grievances against the Tepanek ran deepest, in Texcoco, across the eastern shore of the lake, whose own royal line had suffered exile and murder at Tepanek hands, and in Tlacopan, a smaller Tepanek city that chose, when the moment came, to break from its own kin rather than be devoured alongside them. 3 cities. 3 sets of grievances, braided into a single war. Through the year 1428 the alliance drove against Azcapotzalco with a fury built from a century of swallowed pride, and when the Tepanek capital finally fell, it did not simply lose a battle, it was broken as a power in the valley, its lands divided, its lords stripped of the dominance they had worn as casually as a favorite cloak for 4 generations. And here, in the smoke and the settling dust of that victory, the 3 allied cities did something that would outlast every one of them individually. They did not simply divide the spoils and go their separate ways, as conquerors so often had before. They bound themselves into a formal partnership, what we now call the Triple Alliance, an agreement that shared the tribute of the conquered Tepanek lands among Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, and that promised each city's warriors to the other's wars going forward. It was, in its way, a marriage of convenience between 3 unequal partners, for even from the beginning Tenochtitlan took the largest portion and Tlacopan the smallest, and the balance would only tilt further toward the Mexica as the decades passed. But in 1428, on paper and in the eyes of the valley's other cities, it was 3 thrones acting as one. What Itzcoatl and Tlatoani built from that founding moment was not, strictly speaking, an empire in the way you might first imagine one, no single flag raised over conquered ground, no governors sent to rule in place of local kings. The model the Triple Alliance settled upon, and refined with every campaign that followed, was subtler than occupation and, in its own cold way, more efficient. A city that resisted and lost was rarely destroyed. Its temples were left standing, its own royal line often left seated on its own throne, its daily life scarcely disturbed to the eye of an ordinary farmer tending maize in the terraces. What changed, and changed absolutely, was the flow of wealth. That city now owed tribute, cotton cloaks by the thousands, sacks of cacao beans that could themselves be spent as currency, the iridescent feathers of tropical birds destined for the headdresses of Mexican nobility, gold dust and worked ornaments, raw materials for tools and weapons, and, threaded through every tribute list like a debt paid in flesh, captives, destined for labor or for the temples. A conquered city kept its face and lost its wealth, quietly, year after year, in caravans that walked the roads toward the lake. It was a model built for expansion rather than exhaustion, no garrison to feed indefinitely, no foreign administrator to train, only a standing threat and a running account. And it worked, this pairing of a warrior king's ambition with a strategist's patient bookkeeping, far better than anyone watching Azcapotzalco's fall in 1428 could have predicted. Within a few short years the humble island Refuge would no longer be the smallest voice in its own alliance. But tribute, however finely designed, is a system built on fear as much as on ledgers, and even as the caravans of cotton and cacao and captives began flowing toward Tenochtitlan's growing temples, one question waited quietly beneath all that new wealth, patient as a debt come due: what happens to an empire built on the threat of war, once there is no one left nearby strong enough to threaten back? Let the ledgers rest for a while, and the war drums too, because there is another Tenochtitlan worth knowing, the one that woke each morning to mist rising off the lake, to the soft knock of paddles against canoe hulls, to 100,000 ordinary lives moving through water instead of streets. If you had drifted in on one of those canoes before dawn, you would have understood almost immediately why the Spanish, when they finally came, struggled to describe this place without reaching for impossible comparisons. There was nothing in Europe quite like a city where the roads were rivers and the rivers were farms. Begin with the markets, because the Aztecs themselves might have. At Tlatelolco, the twin city fused to Tenochtitlan's northern edge, technically its own altarpetal until a Mexica king finally folded it in during the 1470s. There spread a marketplace so vast that Bernal Diaz del Castillo, decades later, still reached for soldiers he had known who had seen Rome and Constantinople, and swore this outdid them. 60,000 people, he claimed, moved through it on a single trading day, though even the Spanish who counted such things half suspected they had lost track somewhere past the 10,000. What is certain is the scale of what changed hands there: gold dust carried in the quills of waterfowl feathers, cacao beans stacked and counted as currency, jade and turquoise from the south, obsidian blades sharper than any metal Europe yet forged, cotton cloaks whose weave and dye told you, at a glance, the wearer's rank. There were streets for pottery and streets for slaves, streets where scribes wrote out contracts in the flowing pictographic script of the valley, and officials, the Chanquispan Tlayacac, who walked the aisles settling disputes on the spot, because a market this size needed its own quiet government just to keep functioning. And beneath all of it, feeding it, lay the chinampas, those long, narrow garden plots that the Mexica had built, patiently, out of the lake itself. Reed frames staked into the shallows, packed with mud dredged from the bottom, led again and again until the water gave way to soil rich enough to grow maize, beans, squash, chilies, and the bright marigold sold by the armful at Tlatelolco. Ahujode willows were planted along the plot edges, their roots binding the whole structure together so it would not simply dissolve back into the lake come the next flood season. Some chinampas were tethered loosely enough that, if the stories are to be believed, a whole garden could in theory be poled slowly to a new position, though most, over the years, rooted themselves permanently, until entire districts of the city sat on reclaimed water. It was, in its unhurried way, one of the most productive agricultural systems anywhere in the world at that time, coaxing several harvests a year from land that had not existed a generation before. Canoes moved between the plots at all hours, farmers poling out before light to tend rows that had no equal for yield anywhere the Spanish had sailed from. Those same canoes were the true streets of Tenochtitlan. The city held perhaps 200,000 people at its height, more than London or Paris of that century, and it moved them not on packed dirt roads but through a lattice of canals threaded between the chinampas and the great causeways. A noble travelling to a temple ceremony, a fisherman bringing in the day's catch of lake shrimp and waterfowl, a boy sent to fetch water from a freshwater spring channeled in by aqueduct, all of them went by canoe, paddling quietly past the whitewashed walls of temple precincts, under the shadow of the twin-staired pyramid at the city's heart. Foot traffic existed too, along raised causeways wide enough for 10 horses abreast, but the rhythm of the place, its unhurried, waterborne pace, was set by the canals. It is easy, lying in the dark and picturing it, to hear that rhythm, paddle dipping, hull gliding, the murmur of one canoe passing another in the pre-dawn cool. But for all its watery ease, Tenochtitlan was not a soft place to be born into, and your place in it was decided almost from your first cry. At the top of Mexica society stood the pipiltin, the nobility, descended from royal or high lineage, who wore the finest cotton, ate the cacao, and held the offices of judge, priest, general, and administrator. Below them, forming the great mass of the city, were the Masehultin, the commoners, farmers, canoe builders, weavers, market vendors, the men who paddled the chinampa harvests to Tlatelolco before sunrise. Between these two broad classes moved specialists who did not fit neatly into either, the Pochteca, long-distance merchants who doubled as the empire's eyes and ears in foreign markets, wealthy enough to rival nobles yet careful, always, not to flaunt it where a pilly might take offense, and the skilled artisans, the featherworkers and goldsmiths, whose craft alone earned them a kind of quiet standing. And below everyone stood the Tlacotin, those bound in service to pay a debt or serve a sentence, a condition that, unlike slavery as the Spanish would soon practice it, could be worked off, married out of, or ended by a single act of mercy, and did not pass to one's children. This order was not left to sort itself out by accident of birth alone. It was built, deliberately, into how a child became an adult. Every boy of the pipiltin, from roughly the age of 10, was sent to the Karmikak, a strict boarding school attached to the temple precincts, where priests taught the sacred calendar, the ritual songs, the reading of the old books, the disciplines of fasting and bloodletting that would prepare him for the priesthood, for high command, for the offices his birth had marked out for him. It was cold there, and demanding, and deliberately so. A pilly's comfort in later life was meant to be earned first through hardship. The Masehultin sons went instead to the Telpoch Cali, the house of youth, attached more loosely to their Calpulli, their neighborhood ward, where the lessons leaned toward the practical, warfare, weaponcraft, communal labor, the songs and dances performed at public festivals, and a code of discipline scarcely gentler than the Karmikak's own, enforced by older warriors who had themselves passed through the same rough schooling. A Machawali boy who distinguished himself in battle could, in time, rise, could earn titles, land, even a kind of honorary nobility that his sons might inherit. The gate between classes was narrow, but Tenochtitlan was, in its own severe way, a place that noticed talent when it bled for the city. So the two schools, in their different buildings and their different disciplines, were quietly doing the same work, turning children into the particular kind of adult the city needed, generation after generation, without ever having to ask a soul whether they consented to the role. And that is, perhaps, the thing worth sitting with as the canals go dark and the last market stalls at Tlatelolco are packed away for the night, that a city this beautifully, intricately built, this astonishing in its gardens and its water streets and its 60,000 traders, was also a city that had decided, long before any child could object, exactly what kind of person that child would become. It ran so smoothly, this arrangement, that almost no one thought to ask what waited at the very top of it, in the palace whose canals none of these market boats ever quite approached, where one man's word could still, on any given morning, unmake the order that everyone else's whole life had been built to serve. Rest now, and let the mind drift upward, past the rooftops and the cooking fires, to the thing that mattered more than any market stall or any dyehouse or any child's future, the sky itself, and what the Mexica believed was holding it up. Picture, if you will, a night sky the Aztecs did not trust the way we trust ours. To them, the sun climbing each morning over the eastern lake was never guaranteed. It had failed before. For times before, in fact, for whole worlds, for suns, each one born, each one lit for a while, and each one snuffed out in catastrophe. The first sun, they said, ended when jaguars descended and ate the people who lived beneath it. The second ended in a storm of wind that turned men into monkeys and scattered them through the forests. The third ended in a rain of fire from the heavens. The fourth drowned everything in a flood that never seemed to stop. For failed attempts at a stable world, for false starts, and every one of them a warning folded quietly into the memory of a civilization that never let itself forget how fragile creation actually was. The world the Mexica woke into every morning was the fifth attempt. The fifth sun. And unlike the four that came before, this one did not run on its own. It needed feeding. Here is the shape of the story as the priests told it, generation after generation, in the calm, unhurried cadence of something rehearsed 1,000 times. At the beginning of this age, the gods gathered in darkness at a place called Teotihuacan, and two of them offered to become the sun. One was rich and beautiful and hesitated at the final moment, afraid to leap into the sacrificial fire. The other, poor and covered in sores, did not hesitate. He walked into the flames without flinching, and rose into the sky as the sun. But even then, newly born, the sun would not move. It hung there, motionless, blazing, useless, until the other gods understood what it was asking of them. It wanted their hearts. It wanted their blood. Only when the gods sacrificed themselves, when they gave the sun what it demanded, did it finally begin its slow arc across the sky, and time, as the Mexica understood it, finally began. So from the very first morning of this fifth world, the sun was born owing its motion to sacrifice, and it never stopped needing more. Every sunrise was, in the Mexica imagination, a small miracle wrenched out of darkness by force, not a thing that simply happened on its own. And standing at the center of that daily struggle, the god charged with actually winning it, night after night, was Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south, patron of the Mexica people, a god of war and of the sun in its most dangerous, most heroic aspect. The story went that every night, the sun, Huitzilopochtli himself, in one telling, descended into the underworld and fought his way east through darkness, through the realm of his sister the moon and his 400 brothers the stars, who wanted nothing more than to keep the dawn from ever arriving again. Each morning that the sun rose over the lake was Huitzilopochtli winning, again, a battle that was never finally won, only ever won for one more day. There was no permanent victory in Aztec cosmology. There was only the war continuing, and the question of whether tomorrow's dawn would come at all. This is, perhaps, worth sitting with for a moment as you drift, that the people of Tenochtitlan did not experience sunrise the way we do, as a fact of physics too reliable to notice. They experienced it as a nightly rescue. And a people who believe the sun must be rescued every single night will build their whole city around helping in that rescue. Which brings us to the mountain at the center of it all, not a real mountain, but one built by human hands, rising nearly 200 feet above the plaza at the heart of Tenochtitlan. The Templo Mayor. 2 staircases climbed its western face side by side, and at the top stood not one shrine but 2, standing shoulder to shoulder like siblings who had agreed, long ago, never to be separated. On the southern side stood the shrine to Huitzilopochtli, painted red and white, hung with skulls and war imagery, facing the dry season and the direction the sun climbed at the summer solstice. On the northern side stood the shrine to Tlaloc, the old rain god, painted blue and white, wave and cloud motifs curling up its walls, facing the direction associated with rain and the wet season and the mountains where storms were born. Red and blue. Sun and rain. War and harvest. Fire and water. The Mexica had taken the two forces that could destroy a civilization just as easily as sustain one, drought and flood, war and famine, and given each one a house, side by side, on the same platform, climbed by the same twin staircases, so that neither could be forgotten, and neither could be favored over the other for long. It was, in its way, a kind of balance carved into architecture. The whole city could look up from the canals and the market stalls and see, quite literally, the two things it could not survive without, the sun that gave them light and victory, and the rain that gave them maize. And it was at the base of those twin staircases, on the sun's side, that the debt was paid. It is tempting, hearing this from a great distance of time and culture, to reach immediately for the word cruelty. But that is not quite how the Mexica themselves seem to have understood it, and it is worth trying, gently, to see it as they might have. In their cosmology, the gods had given their own blood to start the world moving. Human beings, in turn, owed the gods a debt they could never fully repay, a debt for the sun's motion, for the rain's arrival, for existence itself. Sacrifice was not, in this framework, an act of gratuitous violence performed for its own sake. It was, as the Mexica themselves described it, next laolistly, a form of payment. A repayment of blood for blood, offered so that the sun would keep rising and the rains would keep falling and the fragile fifth world would not go the way of the four that failed before it. How large that repayment actually was, how many lives, how often, across how many decades, remains one of the most contested questions in the study of ancient Mexico. Spanish chroniclers, arriving generations later with their own reasons to paint the empire as monstrous, wrote of tens of thousands dying in a single ceremony. Modern archaeologists and historians, working from skeletal remains, temple excavations, and a more careful reading of both Spanish and Nahuatl sources, tend to describe numbers far smaller, though still real, still solemn, still woven into the calendar the way a harvest festival or a coronation might be. The truth, most likely, sits somewhere between the chronicler's horror and the apologist's minimizing, smaller than the conquest-era legend, larger than a comfortable footnote, and utterly bound up in a world-view where the sky itself was understood to be perpetually, dangerously, unfinished. And so the temple stood at the center of the city, twin-shrined, red and blue, and every dawn that broke over the lake was, to the people below, proof that the debt had been paid again, that the war in the darkness had been won again, that the fifth world had bought itself one more day. What none of them could yet imagine, what no priest climbing those staircases in the torchlight had any way of foreseeing, was what kind of debt might come due when the strangers finally arrived from the eastern sea, in the very direction the sun itself was born each morning. The years that followed were, by any measure available to the people living through them, the summit of everything Tenochtitlan had built. Moctezuma II came to the reigning mat in 1502, and under him the empire reached further than it had ever reached before, tribute rolls swollen with cotton and cacao and quetzal feathers from provinces that stretched to both oceans, causeways thick with canoes bringing maize to markets that a Spanish soldier would later swear, in his old age, still looked larger and cleaner than anything in Europe. Moctezuma himself was not the storybook tyrant of later legend. He was, by the accounts of those who served him, exacting and formal, a man raised as a priest before he was raised as a ruler, someone who fasted and drew his own blood in penance the way his office required, who read the omens of the heavens the way another kind of king might read a treasury ledger. He inherited a world that made sense. Rain came, maize grew, the sun rose because the debt was paid, and the debt was paid because it had always been paid. For close to 2 decades, that logic held. And then, if you trust the memory of the people who lived it, recorded decades later in Nahuatl, gathered by a Franciscan friar named Bernardino de Sahagun from the mouths of elders who had been children or young men when it happened, and preserved for us now in the pages of a book called The Broken Spears, the sky itself seemed to lean in and take notice. Picture it as they described it, because that is how it survives, not as an item on a list, but as a memory someone carried for 60 years and finally spoke aloud to a scribe who wrote it down in the old language, patiently, as an old man's testimony rather than a curiosity. 10 years, they said, before the strangers came, a fire appeared in the sky. It rose in the east at midnight and climbed until dawn swallowed it, night after night, a column of light like a wound bleeding upward, bright enough to wake a city that slept by the rhythm of drums and conch shells and priestly hours. People gathered on their rooftops in the dark to watch it, murmuring, because a comet was never just a comet in that world view, the sky was a text, and this was a sentence no one could quite finish reading. Moctezuma, they say, was told, and he climbed to a high place himself to see it, and stood there a long while in silence. Then came the second sign, stranger still, because fire is supposed to obey certain rules and this fire did not. The temple of Huitzilopochtli, the very shrine at the summit of that twin staircase we have already climbed together, the house of the war god who fed the sun each dawn, caught alight with no torch near it, no spark that anyone could name, and burned so fiercely that water thrown against it seemed only to feed the flame rather than smother it. Men ran with jars from the canals and poured them uselessly. The wooden temple crown burned to nothing while priests who had spent their whole lives tending that exact fire, who understood combustion and thatch and wind as well as any people alive, stood by unable to explain what they were watching. A third sign came from the lake itself, and this one might unsettle you more than the others, because it asks you to imagine a stillness broken from underneath rather than above. Texcoco lay flat and glassy under a clear sky, the accounts say, no wind at all, the kind of hush that should have meant nothing was happening, and then the water began to seethe, to boil and heave and crash against the causeways as though some enormous unseen hand beneath the surface had begun to shake the lake in its basin. Houses along the shore cracked and fell into the churning water. And still, above it all, not a breath of wind. And then, quietest and perhaps eeriest of all, a voice. Night after night, a woman was heard weeping through the streets of the city, her cry rising and falling in the dark long after the markets had closed and the causeway gates had shut. My children, she was heard to say, we must go far away. And then, further into the night, closer to the lake, my children, where shall I take you? No one who searched ever found her. Later generations would remember her as a figure close to what we might now call La Llorona, the weeping woman, though in that moment she had no name at all, only a sound moving through the dark, grieving for something that had not yet been lost. You are meant, hearing this now, to hold these stories the way the Mexica themselves likely held them, not as simple prophecy, weighed and understood in the moment, but as memory reshaped by hindsight, the way any people who have survived a catastrophe will later find, scattered through the years before it, a pattern that gives the disaster a shape and a warning it did not have while it was merely being lived. Comets did cross the sky in that decade, astronomy confirms as much. Temples did sometimes burn, lakes did sometimes churn with the seismic tremors that still shake that valley today, and grief did sometimes wander city streets given voice by ordinary people mourning ordinary deaths. What is harder to know, this many centuries later, is how much dread these events carried in the moment they happened, and how much was added afterward, by survivors reaching backward through the wreckage of everything they had lost, searching for the instant the gods had first tried to warn them. But something in the record insists that whatever the truth of the omens, the unease was real, and it belonged most of all to the one man whose entire office was built on reading the sky correctly. Moctezuma consulted his diviners, his readers of the calendar, the wise old men and women whose art was watching the pattern of the world and telling him what it meant. And where they had always had answers before, an eclipse meant this, a dry season meant that, now, increasingly, they had none. Some, the accounts say, could no longer read the signs at all, as though whatever gift had let them see clearly had simply gone dark. Others he had put to death in his frustration, for failing him, for their silence, which only deepened the silence around him rather than breaking it. A ruler who had built his authority on being able to answer the sky was, for the first time in his reign, watching the sky ask him a question he could not answer back. He did not yet know what was coming from the eastern sea. He only knew, in that quiet, mounting dread of a man used to certainty, that something was. The thing came, in the end, not as an omen in the sky but as a man on foot, arriving dust-streaked at the edge of the lake causeways with a bundle of painted cloth under his arm. This was how Moctezuma's world worked, and it had worked this way for generations. A relay of runners, chosen for speed and trained for it since childhood, could carry news the length of the empire in a matter of days, each one sprinting his stretch of road before passing the message to the next like a flame handed from candle to candle. And in the early months of what we now call 1517, the news that reached him this way was stranger than anything the relay had ever carried. Ships had appeared off the coast, near the land of the Maya, in the region we now call the Yucatan. Not canoes. Not anything his coastal governors had words for. Towers on the water, the report said, floating houses with wings of cloth that caught the wind. Men had come ashore from them, pale, some of them bearded in a way unfamiliar to the Mexica, wrapped in strange metals that caught the sun like water. You can imagine him unrolling that first painted cloth by lamplight, the pigment still faintly sharp with the smell of the coast, tracing the glyphs and figures with the same eyes that had once read eclipses and star tables with total confidence, and finding, this time, that the pictures resisted him. It was a fleet under a man named Hernandez de Córdoba, sailing from the Spanish base in Cuba, and the encounter had not gone gently. There had been a battle near a place the Spanish would call Champotón, canoes and obsidian-edged weapons against steel, and Córdoba himself had taken wounds from which he would later die. The strangers had sailed away. For a moment, it might have seemed a closed matter, an odd tide washed up, then withdrawn. But the sea does not forget its habits, and less than a year later, in 1518, the runners came again. Another fleet, larger this time, under a young commander named Juan de Grijalva. This one did not simply skirmish and vanish. It traded. It anchored longer. It moved up the coast toward the Tabasco region and beyond, and this time the local peoples, wiser to caution, offered gifts instead of only spears, and received gifts in turn. Cotton cloth. Beads of a green stone the Spanish did not yet understand was jade, and prized less than the Mexica did. And gold. Small amounts of it, offered almost as an afterthought by the coastal people, who valued it far less than jade or quetzal feathers, and which the strangers received with an attention that should perhaps have told Moctezuma something, if only he had had the vocabulary yet to read it. Gold, to men who had crossed an ocean, was not decoration. It was the entire reason for the crossing. All of this reached Tenochtitlan the same way: runner, cloth, painted account, and Moctezuma, we are told, received each report with a stillness that unsettled the men who brought it. He asked questions the messengers could not answer. What did their faces look like beneath the beards? Did they eat like men? Did their vessels ride the water like something built, or like something that lived? He had them describe the same details again and again, turning them over as though repetition might yield an answer that a single telling had not. It is here that the story, over the centuries since, has gathered its most famous embellishment, the idea that Moctezuma believed these strangers might be the return of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, a god-king said to have sailed away eastward long before with a promise, in some tellings, to come back one day in a year that shared his sacred name. It is a beautiful, terrible symmetry, and it has been told in books and painted in murals for 500 years, this image of an emperor paralyzed by prophecy, undone before a single Spanish boot touched the mainland. But you should know, drifting through this part of the story, that the historians who have spent their lives with the actual sources, Camilla Townsend, Matthew Restall, among others, read that version with real suspicion. The clearest tellings of the Quetzalcoatl Return's tale were written down decades after the conquest, often by Spanish friars and their Nahua students working together, at a time when a narrative of divine inevitability was rather useful to the victors. It cast the fall of an empire not as a war, won and lost, but as fate arriving on schedule. It made Moctezuma into a man who had already surrendered in his heart before he ever met his conquerors, which is a convenient story for the people writing the histories afterward, and a suspiciously flattering one. What the earlier, harder evidence suggests instead is something less mythic and, in its way, more human. A ruler faced with unclassifiable strangers, uncertain of their nature, uncertain of their intentions, doing what any careful sovereign of a vast and watchful empire would do, gathering information before committing to a response. He did not rally his armies to the coast. He did not close his ports in panic. Instead, he sent gifts, rich ones, textiles and featherwork and those small offerings of gold that so interested his visitors, gestures that in Mexican diplomacy could mean welcome, could mean respect, could also mean a kind of careful distance. Here is something of value, now keep your distance while we decide what you are. And alongside the gifts, by every reasonable reading of the sources, he sent watchers. Men whose task was simply to see, and remember, and report back through the runners, so that whatever image formed in his mind of these visitors would be built from observation rather than fear alone. It is the choice of a man trying to buy himself time to think, in a moment when thinking had become unusually difficult, when, as we have already heard, the priests who once read the sky for him had begun to fall silent, when the signs themselves seemed to have gone dark. Perhaps that is why the old legend of the returning god took hold so easily afterward, retold and elaborated once the outcome was already known. It is always tempting, once a thing has happened, to believe it could only ever have happened that way. But in 1518, in the palace at the heart of the lake, nothing was yet decided. The strangers from the Grijalva fleet had sailed north along the coast and vanished over the horizon, gold in their holds and a story of their own to tell back in Cuba, a story about a rich, ordered, populous land somewhere beyond the beaches, ruled, they had gathered, by a great lord in a city on a lake. That story, once it reached the right ears in Cuba, would not simply fade the way Cordoba's skirmish had. A more ambitious man than either of the first two captains was already listening. And within the year, the ships would come a third time, this time not to trade a little and turn back toward home, but to stay, and to begin asking questions of their own. The dawn came up grey over the Gulf, and the first thing the land gave the fleet was not gold but insects, clouds of them, rising off the mangroves as the 11 ships found their anchorage in the lee of a low sandy point the Spanish would come to call Villarica de la Vera Cruz, the True Cross. It was Good Friday of the year 1519, and Hernan Cortés stood at the rail of his flagship watching the surf break white against a shore that gave away nothing of what lay behind it. Somewhere beyond that beach, 7 days hard walking to the west and then higher still, the lake city waited, though no one aboard those ships could yet have named it, or guessed at its size, or begun to imagine the water streets and the floating gardens and the towers washed in stucco so bright they seemed, from a distance, to be made of something other than stone. Cortés was 34, a minor hidalgo from Extremadura who had come to the Indies as a young man with little but ambition and a talent for making himself indispensable to men more powerful than himself. He had farmed in Cuba, served the governor Diego Velázquez loyally enough to be trusted, and then, when the command of this third expedition was finally his, had moved with a speed that unsettled even his patron, provisioning ships and buying arms so quickly, on credit and on nerve, that Velázquez began to suspect he had made a mistake in his choice of captain, and tried, too late, to recall him. Cortés had simply sailed. It was the first of many moments in this story where a single choice would foreclose every gentler alternative, and it would not be the last. The fleet that came ashore that February and March numbered perhaps 500 soldiers, a little over 100 sailors, 16 horses led trembling down ramps into the surf, and a scattering of small cannon that would prove, in the months ahead, to matter far more than their size suggested. It was a modest force by the standards of a European war. Set against a valley that could summon tens of thousands of warriors within days, it was almost nothing at all. What it carried instead of numbers was steel and horses no one in this land had ever seen, and something harder to weigh, a will, concentrated entirely in one restless man, to turn whatever he found into a kingdom. Before Vera Cruz, though, there had been Patonchon, a Contal Maya town on the Tabasco coast where the Spanish had fought a brief, bloody skirmish and then received, as part of a peace offering, 20 enslaved women, given the way defeated peoples of that world gave tribute, as goods, as a gesture of submission, without much thought for what any one woman might become. Among them was one the Spanish would baptize Marina, and history would remember by the name her own people gave her, Malintzin, or, in the diminished, complicated shorthand of the conquest, Malinche. She could not have looked, that first week, like someone who would help decide the fate of an empire. But she carried in her something rarer than any single soldier's sword arm. She had been born, it seems, into a Nawa noble family near the empire's southern edge, and sold or given away into Maya-speaking territory as a girl, so that by the time the Spanish ships arrived she held 2 languages of the region fluently, Nahuatl and Contal Maya, layered one on top of the other by the accident of a hard childhood. Aboard the fleet was a Spaniard named Geronimo de Aguilar, a shipwrecked priest who had spent 8 years a captive among the Maya and had learned their tongue well enough to preach in it. Neither man understood a word of Nahuatl. Between the two of them and the woman who stood at the joint, an unlikely chain took shape, Cortés speaking Spanish to Aguilar, Aguilar rendering it into Maya for Malintzin, Malintzin turning it into Nahuatl for whatever lord or emissary stood listening, and then the whole relay running back the other way, thought by thought, patient as a heartbeat. It was slow. It was also, within weeks, the only reason Cortés could speak to the empire at all, and within the year Malintzin herself would learn enough Spanish to cut Aguilar out of the chain entirely, becoming not merely an interpreter but the single mind through which 2 worlds tried, imperfectly, to understand one another. It was at Vera Cruz that Cortés made the decision his men would talk about for the rest of their lives, the one that turned a risky landing into something with no way back. Quietly, and against the grumbling of the men still loyal to Velázquez's authority back in Cuba, he had his ships run aground and stripped of anything useful, then broken apart, scuttled, in the telling that has come down through the centuries, though the truth was closer to a slow, deliberate dismantling than a single dramatic sinking. Either way the effect was the same. There would be no sailing home. Whatever these 500 men were going to become, they were going to become it here, on this coast, with the sea now nothing more than a horizon behind them rather than a road. And in the same stroke he solved a second problem, a legal one as much as a military one. Cortés held no royal commission to conquer anything, only Velázquez's authorization to trade and explore, an authorization the governor was already trying to strip from him. So on that beach his men, following a script that was itself an old Spanish legal fiction, formally founded a town, Villa Rica de la Vera Cruz, elected a town council, and had that council, men Cortés himself had chosen, appoint him captain general, answerable now not to the governor of Cuba but directly to the crown in Castile. It was a piece of theatre, and everyone aboard knew it was theatre, but theatre performed correctly, before witnesses, notarized. It gave Cortés a legal skin to wear, and it meant that whatever came next would not be mutiny. It would be conquest, undertaken, on paper, in the king's name. The ships were gone. The town was founded. And somewhere inland, word of pale strangers with floating houses and thunder weapons was already traveling faster than any of them could walk, toward a ruler who had been hearing such stories, in one form or another, for a year, and who would now have to decide, at last, what to do about men who so plainly did not intend to leave. The road into the highlands did not announce itself as the edge of a war. It rose slowly, the humid coastal air giving way to something thinner and cooler, pine and dust replacing salt and mangrove, and for a time the column of a few hundred Spaniards and their growing train of coastal allies simply walked, day after day, through country that watched them without yet deciding what they were. That decision would be made, finally, by a people who had never bowed to the Aztec Emperor and had no intention of starting now. Tlaxcala was a small republic, proud and encircled, an island of independence inside the vast reach of the Triple Alliance, kept that way for generations by treaties of convenience the Aztecs found useful. Better a defiant neighbor to fight in ritual wars than a conquered one demanding grain in a famine year. Tlaxcala paid no tribute, and Tlaxcala had bled for that privilege, and when word reached its council chamber that pale strangers with strange beasts were marching toward its borders, the answer was not curiosity. It was resistance. The young general Xicotencatl, the son, not the aged and nearly blind lord who shared his name, did not wait to be asked twice. He gathered warriors by the thousand, and across a handful of days in early September, he sent them against the Spanish column in waves that must have seemed, from the Spanish side, almost without end. Imagine it as sound before it is sight, a rising hum from the hillsides, the shudder of conch shell horns, and then the field simply filling with men, banners of white and red catching the wind, obsidian glinting along the edges of clubs, the whole valley suddenly alive with motion. The Spanish had steel, horses, a handful of cannon, crossbows, and matchlocks that cracked and smoked in a landscape that had never heard such sounds before. They had, too, exhaustion, hunger, wounds that would not close, and men who by their own account began, in private, to write what they believed might be their final letters home. 3 times, roughly, the armies met in pitched combat, and 3 times the Spanish and their Totonac and Sempolan allies held the field by the end of the day, narrowly, bloodily, more through the shock value of cavalry and gunpowder against warriors who had never faced either than through any superiority of arms. It would be comforting, in the softened memory of later centuries, to call these clean victories. They were not. Men died slowly in the grass that week, and the young general watched an enemy he could not dislodge, and it must have troubled him more than any single defeat, because these strangers, unlike every other force Tlaxcala had ever met, simply would not break. And so the elder lords of Tlaxcala did what proud, encircled, exhausted people sometimes do when a new door opens where a wall had always stood. They talked. Quietly, cautiously, through envoys sent under cover of the same night skirmishes that had nearly ended the Spanish expedition, the older council, the blind Lord Xicotencatl the elder among them, along with fellow rulers of the 4 Tlaxcalan lordships, reached toward peace. Not surrender. An alliance. They had resisted the Mexica for 100 years precisely because the tribute demanded of conquered peoples was crushing, humiliating, sometimes measured in the bodies of their own sons taken for sacrifice in the capital's temples. Here, unbelievably, marched an armed force capable of fighting that empire on equal terms. The logic, cold and pragmatic as it was, made a kind of sense that no amount of Spanish steel alone ever could have produced. Cortés was not simply tolerated into Tlaxcala after the fighting stopped. He was welcomed, housed, fed, and offered something no Spanish sword could have won by itself, an army. Tlaxcalan warriors, in numbers that would soon dwarf the Spanish contingent many times over, would march at Cortés's side from that point onward, all the way to the gates of the lake city itself. Whatever happened next, the campaign was no longer a few hundred foreigners against an empire. It had become, in its truest shape, one Mesoamerican people's grievance wearing Spanish armor as its excuse. From Tlaxcala the combined force turned toward Cholula, a city sacred to the god Quetzalcoatl, a place of pilgrimage and market and old alliances with the Aztec capital, and, crucially, a rival of Tlaxcala's for generations. The welcome there was outwardly gracious. Lodging was given, food provided, the streets crowded with the ordinary business of a great trading city. But the Tlaxcalan allies marching with Cortés warned him, again and again, that Cholula could not be trusted, that its lords answered ultimately to Tenochtitlan, that Moctezuma's hand could be felt behind the smiling hospitality. Whether the warning was accurate, or whether it was old rivalry finding a convenient new weapon, no one listening now can say with certainty. The sources that survive were written by the very men who acted on the fear, and dead cities do not testify in their own defense. What is certain is what happened next. On a morning in October, word reached the Spanish camp, through Malintzin, the same young translator who had stood beside Cortés since the coast, who by some accounts learned of a plot from a Cholulan noblewoman who tried to warn her rather than see her harmed, that an ambush was being prepared, warriors said to be massing beyond the city's edges, pits and barricades allegedly readied in the streets. Believing themselves about to be slaughtered, Cortés and his allies moved first. The city's nobles and warriors were summoned, by invitation, into the temple courtyard at the center of Cholula, ostensibly to receive final instructions before the Spanish departed. And there, within walled courtyards from which there was no easy retreat, the killing began. Swords and Tlaxcalan war clubs fell on men who had come, many of them, unarmed and expecting only a formal farewell. Estimates from the period range into the thousands dead, the plaza running with blood, fires afterwards set through parts of the city, the great temple precinct left in ruin. Whether the ambush had ever truly existed, or existed only in rumor amplified by men eager to break Cholula's usefulness to the Aztec cause, would be argued long after every witness was dust. News of it did not stay in Cholula. It traveled the causeways and market roads exactly as the news of Veracruz had traveled before it, faster now, because this time it carried something more than gossip about strange animals and strange men. It carried proof of what these strangers were capable of when they believed themselves threatened, and it reached the floating city on the lake, and the ears of the man who ruled it, days before the marching column itself ever came into view of the volcanoes that guarded the valley beyond. The road down from the mountains had taken them through cold pine forest and then, quite suddenly, into light, the kind of light that made men stop and say nothing for a moment. Below them lay the Valley of Mexico, and in the middle of it, ringed by silver water, the city itself, its temples catching the late afternoon sun like something built from another material altogether than stone. Benol Diaz, marching in that column, would write decades later that some of the soldiers wondered if they were dreaming, and that others asked whether this was not, in fact, all enchantment, so little did it resemble anything they had seen in Spain or the islands before it. They came down through Iztapalapa, a lakeside town of terraced gardens and canals, and there the great causeway began, a raised road of packed earth and stone running straight across open water toward the heart of Tenochtitlan, wide enough for 10 horsemen abreast, lined at intervals with modest shrines, and crowded now, on both sides, with people who had come out in their canoes and stood along the water's edge simply to look. It was the 8th of November, 1519. Cortés rode near the front with perhaps 400 Spaniards on foot and a small company of horse, and behind them came several thousand allied warriors from Tlaxcala and Sempoala, men who had joined the column in the week since Cholula, drawn by old grievances against the Aztec state and by the simple calculation that these strangers might, at last, be the ones to end it. Ahead, where the causeway narrowed toward a gatehouse of wood and whitewashed stone, a procession was assembling to meet them, the color of it visible long before the shapes resolved into men. Quetzal feathers, worked into towering headdresses. Cloaks dyed the deep blue reserved for the highest rank. Gold at wrists and ears and lips, catching what light there was. At the center of it, borne on the shoulders of noblemen upon a litter canopied in green feathers and worked silver, rode Moctezuma himself, ruler of the Mexica, a man who by every account moved slowly and spoke rarely and was looked upon, by his own people, in something closer to the manner one looks upon fire than upon a king. 2 lords walked at his side, steadying him, his nephew Cacama, ruler of Texcoco, and his brother Cuitlahuac, lord of Iztapalapa, the very town they had just passed through. Attendants swept the ground ahead of the litter and laid down cloth so that the emperor's feet, when at last he stepped down, would never touch bare earth. Cortés dismounted and came forward, and here the 2 calculations of the day met face to face for the first time. The Spanish captain, by his own later account, moved to embrace the emperor as one might a fellow sovereign in Castile, and was gently, firmly prevented. Moctezuma's attendant stepped between them. Such a man was not to be touched, not even in courtesy, by anyone outside the small circle permitted to come near his person. What passed between the two of them instead was an exchange of a different kind. Cortés offered a necklace of glass beads strung on gold thread and scented, deliberately, with musk and amber, a small vanity of the Spanish court, dazzling to eyes that had never seen glass before. Moctezuma, in turn, had brought 2 necklaces worked from red shells and golden shrimp shaped in fine gold, and he placed one of them, it is recorded, over Cortés's own neck with his own hands. And then he spoke. The words survive in more than one telling, filtered always through translators, Malintzin rendering Nahuatl into Contal Maya, Geronimo de Aguilar rendering that into Spanish, each pass a small further distance from whatever was actually meant. Cortés remembered Moctezuma saying that the Spanish had come to their own home, that they should rest now, that all would be shown to them. Some historians since have heard in those words a formal welcome and nothing more, the fixed courtesies owed to any honored visitor of rank, the same phrases a Mexican lord might use to greet an ambassador from a rival city he intended to watch very closely indeed. Others have wondered whether Moctezuma believed, even briefly, that he was welcoming something larger than a visiting captain, a fulfillment of unease that had been building in the city for months, of omens read by priests in comet light and lake tremor and the strange behavior of temple fires. What is certain only is that no one within earshot that afternoon could have said, watching the 2 men incline their heads to one another beside the shrine at the causeway's edge, which one believed himself to be in command of what would happen next. The procession then turned and moved together into the city, Moctezuma's litter leading, the Spanish column following in careful order behind the mounted vanguard, and the crowds that had watched in silence from their canoes now pressed closer along the causeway edges and the rooftops beyond, thousands of them, watching the strangers pass, their metal, their beards, their animals unlike anything bred on this side of the ocean. They crossed drawbridges over the gaps left deliberately in the causeway, gaps that could be opened to flood the road in time of siege, though no soldier in that column paused long enough that day to consider what such a design implied. They passed markets, canals thick with canoe traffic, the white plaster of temple walls, until at last the procession arrived at a walled compound near the heart of the city, the palace that had belonged to Axiacatl, Moctezuma's own father, a ruler 2 generations gone, its rooms vast enough to house the entire Spanish company and its allies together, its walls close enough to the great temple precinct that the smoke of copal incense drifted over the courtyard by evening. It was, on its face, a generous lodging, spacious, provisioned, its granaries and storerooms already stocked with maize and fowl and cacao, servants assigned to attend to every need the visitors might name. Cortés would later admit, in the letters he sent back across the ocean, that he had accepted the hospitality with genuine gratitude and equally genuine unease, uncertain whether he had just been welcomed into a home or walked, by his own request, into a cage from which the door could be shut at any hour his host chose. Moctezuma, for his part, had placed the strangers exactly where he could watch them most closely, inside walls his own family had built, at the center of a city of tens of thousands, ringed by water on every side, with the causeways and their bridges under his own command should he ever wish to close them. Night settled over the lake, and torches were lit along the courtyard walls, and somewhere beyond them the temple drums kept their slow, unhurried rhythm, as they had every evening for as long as anyone in that palace could remember. 200 strangers slept that night inside the heart of the greatest city in the Americas, guests of a man who had just called them welcome, in rooms built by a king who had never imagined who might one day sleep beneath his roof, and whether that welcome would hold until morning was a question that not even Moctezuma himself, lying wakeful in his own palace across the plaza, could yet have answered. 6 days. That was all it took for welcome to curdle into something else, and the excuse, when it came, arrived by canoe from the coast, carried by runners who had crossed the causeway at a dead run and knelt before Cortés with news that gave him exactly what he needed. At Vera Cruz, in the garrison Cortés had left behind when he marched inland, a Spanish captain named Juan de Escalante lay dead, along with several of his men, killed in a clash with warriors under the command of a local lord named Qualpopoca, a governor loyal to Moctezuma on the Gulf Coast. One soldier's head, it was said, had been taken and sent inland as a kind of grim trophy, paraded through towns that owed Tenochtitlan its tribute, so that the people there might see for themselves that these strangers could bleed and die like anyone else. It was, in its way, an act of war. And Cortés, hearing it, did not send envoys or demand an inquiry. He walked instead into Moctezuma's own rooms, with his captains at his back, and told the Emperor of the Mexica, ruler of the valley, master of 100 subject cities, that he now believed him responsible. Picture that room. Woven mats on stone floors, incense drifting from braziers, the soft murmur that always surrounded a man of Moctezuma's rank, and into it, uninvited, the clatter of Spanish boots and the particular silence that falls when armed men stop pretending to be guests. Moctezuma denied it, of course. He said, and perhaps it was even true, that Qualpopoca had acted alone, that no order had come from the palace at Tenochtitlan, that he himself had had no hand in any Spanish deaths. But denial no longer mattered. Cortés proposed, if that is the word for it, that Moctezuma come and live for a time among the Spaniards, in the palace of his father Axayacatl where they were already quartered, as a guest, he said, under his own free will. He would keep his servants. He would keep his rank. He would want for nothing. He would also, everyone in that room understood without needing to say it aloud, be a prisoner. There are different accounts of what happened next, whispered down through the centuries by men who were there and men who only wished they had been. Some say Moctezuma wept. Some say one of Cortés's own captains, a hard, impatient man named Velázquez de Leon, spoke the words that finally moved him, that he must come now, alive, or the alternative would be a death that would help no one. What is not in dispute is the outcome. Moctezuma rose from his own throne, dressed in his own city, called for his litter, and let himself be carried across the plaza to a smaller set of rooms inside his father's old palace, now the Spanish garrison, surrounded now not by his own royal guard alone but by men in steel who watched every door. He told his nobles it was his own wish. He told the crowds that gathered, uneasy and murmuring, along the route that he went gladly, to be nearer his new friends, to continue certain rites and consultations more conveniently. Whether anyone truly believed him is another question, one that would take a long time to answer, and not kindly. Qualpopoca was sent for and brought to the capital along with his son and 15 of his warriors, and in the courtyard just outside Moctezuma's new rooms, close enough, some accounts say, that he could hear it, they were burned. It is said that the wooden weapons stacked from the city's own armories were used as kindling for the fire, a detail that would have meant something to men trained since boyhood to read significance into every object, every substitution. And it is said, too, though this detail is harder to verify and impossible now to unhear once heard, that during those hours Moctezuma was kept in shackles, a small private cruelty visited on a man who, in every public appearance from that day forward, would need to seem entirely free. And so began the strangest months in the history of that city on the lake, a season in which the ordinary machinery of an empire kept turning, gears grinding on in a room that had, without most of its subjects quite realizing it, quietly changed its shape. Moctezuma held court still. Nobles came to him in the mornings as they always had, bringing petitions, tribute counts, questions of law and ceremony, and he answered them, seated, composed, dressed as an emperor dresses, in the way his whole life had trained him to be dressed even in private, even now. Priests came for the calendar rites that could not simply stop because a ruler had moved his household, the feasts still needed dates set, the temples still needed their offerings, the machinery of the sacred year still turned regardless of who slept where at night. Runners still arrived with news from Tlaxcala, from the coast, from towns whose names meant tribute in maize or cloth or gold, and Moctezuma still received that news and issued the small daily decisions of empire as though nothing at all had shifted beneath his feet. He played games with his captors, 2 hours of patoli, the dice and board game of chance he had always loved, with young Pedro de Alvarado at his side, wagering gold ornaments and cacao beans back and forth across the mat while soldiers stood watching at the door. He went hawking on the lake, carried out by canoe with a Spanish escort rowing alongside, released for an afternoon into something that must have felt, briefly, like his old life, until the boats turned back toward the palace and the doors closed again for the night. He allowed a Christian altar to be raised in one of his own rooms, permitted Mass to be said, listened to sermons on a God not his own with the patient, unreadable courtesy of a man who had spent his whole reign learning to give nothing away in his face. But something had changed in how the city watched him, even if no one yet had the words for it. The tribute still came. The market still opened at dawn in Tlatelolco, still filled with turkeys and cacao and jade and the endless cloth bales that had always meant the empire was functioning as it should. Yet underneath that continuity ran a current of something unsettled, nobles exchanging glances a beat too long, priests whose questions about ritual timing seemed to carry a second meaning, a growing hush in certain corners of the palace where servants had once spoken freely. How long, after all, could an empire go on believing its emperor still held the reins, when the man himself no longer slept in his own bed, no longer walked his own halls without an escort of foreign spears? Somewhere among the nobility, in rooms the Spaniards did not enter and could not hear, that question was beginning, quietly, to be asked aloud, and the answer, whatever it would turn out to be, was still many weeks from arriving. The gold, when it finally came, did not come as art. It came as weight. In the rooms the Spaniards had claimed within the old palace of Axiacatl, a forge was built where none had stood before, and the fire that fed it burned longer into the night than any hearth in Tenochtitlan had reason to burn. Here, piece by piece, the tribute of a civilization was fed into the flame. Breastplates worked in gold so fine they had taken master goldsmiths months to hammer and anneal. Necklaces cast in the shape of quetzal feathers, so delicate that a breath might have disturbed them, curling now into shapeless ingots the size of a man's forearm. Diadems meant for gods. Earspools meant for kings. A jaguar, once cast whole in gold leaf so thin it seemed to breathe, reduced in an afternoon to a bar stamped with a Castilian mark. The Spaniards did not see art. They saw currency, and currency, to them, was more honest melted down, weighed, divided, portioned into the royal fifth for the crown and the rest split among captains and men, a bureaucracy of greed laid over treasures that had once been offerings to Huitzilopochtli himself. Aztec goldsmiths, some of whom had made these very pieces with their own hands, were made to stand nearby and watch, or worse, made to assist, coached in the crude Spanish preference for bars over beauty. It was, for a culture in which gold had never been currency but symbol, sacrament, sunlight given form, a violation that went beyond mere theft. It was the erasure of meaning itself. A god's radiance turned into a merchant's weight. If the melting of the gold was a wound to the eye, what came next was a wound to the soul of the city. Emboldened by weeks without resistance, by a captive emperor who counseled patience to his own nobles, some of Cortés's men, encouraged, some accounts suggest, by the friars who had sailed with the expedition, eager to plant the cross wherever Spanish boots found purchase, began to speak of placing a Christian altar atop the Templo Mayor itself. Not beside it. Atop it. In the chamber of Huitzilopochtli, war god and patron of the Mexica, where blood offerings had sustained the sun's daily rebirth for 2 centuries, they wished to raise an image of the Virgin and a plain wooden cross. Cortés, when the moment came, did not simply order the old gods removed. By some accounts he climbed the temple steps himself, breathless in the thin valley air, and stood before the priests and idols with a demand that shocked even his own men with its boldness, that the shrine be given over, its stone gods cast down, its stained altars scrubbed clean of the blood-black patina of centuries. Moctezuma, brought to intervene, pleaded with him. To touch the god, he said, was to invite catastrophe, not from Spanish swords, but from the god himself, whose anger the Mexica people would suffer long after the strangers had gone. A compromise was struck, as compromises so often are, satisfying no one. The Spaniards would be permitted their small chapel in one chamber of the temple complex, while the old gods kept their place in the other. 2 altars under one roof, 2 faiths sharing a summit that had never before known division. It was a small thing, on the surface. A room. A statue. A cross of pale wood beside idols of black stone and turquoise inlay. But to the priesthood of Tenochtitlan, men who had given their lives, sometimes literally, in ritual bloodletting from ears and thighs and tongues, to the maintenance of a cosmic order they alone understood, it was an obscenity that could not be unseen. The temple was meant to be the axis of the world, the place where the sacred and the mundane met and were kept, through ceremony, from collapsing into one another. Now foreign gods sat within arm's reach of Huitzilopochtli's sanctuary, and nothing terrible had yet happened, no earthquake, no eclipse, no sign from the heavens, and that, perhaps, was the most unsettling thing of all. Either the old order no longer held the power it once had, or it was gathering itself for something the priests could not yet name. It was in these weeks, quietly, in the long chambers behind the temple precinct where incense still burned and where young priests trained in the old chants even as gold vanished from the treasury above them, that resistance began to take a shape more organized than mere unease. There is no single moment historians can point to, no meeting recorded, no manifesto sworn. What survived instead, in the fragments gathered decades later from the mouths of old men who had been young priests and young nobles in that year, is a texture, the sense of certain figures moving between temple and palace with unusual frequency, of Cuauhtémoc, the emperor's own brother, listening more than he spoke in gatherings where Spaniards were not present, of a caste of warrior nobles, men trained since boyhood for exactly this kind of moment, and denied any outlet for it by an emperor, who counseled calm, growing restless in a way that calm alone could no longer contain. The humiliation was not abstract to them. It was daily, physical, witnessed. Their emperor, Tlatoani of the greatest power the valley had ever known, slept now in a chamber he could not leave without Spanish escort, ate meals a Spanish guard had watched being prepared, received his own nobles in audiences where foreign soldiers stood along the walls with their strange weapons close at hand. Motecazoma's counsel, wait, endure, let the strangers tire of us or destroy themselves through their own greed, had made sense in November, when the shock of the strangers' arrival was still fresh and their intention still unclear. By spring, with gold ash still drifting from the palace forge and a foreign god enthroned a few steps from their own, that counsel had begun to sound, to younger and hungrier ears, less like wisdom and more like surrender. Word had also begun arriving from the coast, fragments, rumors, half-confirmed reports of trouble among the strangers themselves, of ships and soldiers Cortés had not expected, of a rival Spanish force said to be marching from Cuba to arrest him for disobedience to his own governor. If such a thing were true, it would mean the strangers were not the single, unified, unstoppable force they had presented themselves to be. It would mean they, too, could be divided, weakened, made small. No one in Tenochtitlan yet knew how much truth lay in that rumor, or what Cortés himself would choose to do about it, whether he would stay to defend what he had claimed, or ride to meet this new threat and leave the city, for the first time in months, without its captor close at hand. The rumors, in the end, proved true, and stranger than rumor usually allows itself to be. Within days, the fragments hardening into fact, a fleet had indeed appeared off the coast near Vera Cruz, 19 ships riding low in the water, carrying nearly 1,000 Spanish soldiers, more cannon than Cortés himself had ever commanded, and horses in numbers the men in Tenochtitlan could scarcely picture, since to them a single horse had seemed miracle enough. At the head of this fleet stood a broad, red-bearded officer named Panfilo de Novaes, sent not as reinforcement but as a rest party. Governor Diego Velázquez of Cuba, the man who had financed the original expedition and watched Cortés slip its leash entirely, sailing for the mainland without license, founding a town, declaring himself answerable only to the crown in Spain and not to the governor who had paid for his ships, had decided he would tolerate no more of it. Novaes carried orders to seize Hernando Cortés, bind him, and send him back to Cuba in chains, or, failing that, to simply kill him where he stood and take command of everything he had built. It was, in its way, exactly the crack in the foundation that Moctezuma's counselors had begun to whisper about in the last quiet stretch of that long spring, the possibility that the strangers were not one thing, single-minded and unbreakable, but many things pulling against each other, ambitious men circling the same prize. And for a few days it must have seemed, from inside the palace where Moctezuma still lived under a kind of gentle captivity, that the gods or fortune or simple Spanish greed might do the work that no Mexican army had yet managed, that the invaders might simply destroy one another and spare the city the trouble. Cortés did not wait to find out how it would resolve on its own. He was, whatever else history would say of him, a man who understood the value of speed, and he understood, too, that a rival with 1,000 men and no experience of this country was more dangerous sitting still than moving. If Novaes had time to march inland, to learn from local allies where the gold was and how thin the Spanish garrison in Tenochtitlan had truly stretched itself, the whole gamble Cortés had built, the audacious, half-mad occupation of the greatest city in the Americas by a few hundred foreigners, could collapse before it had even finished forming. So he made his choice, and it was the choice of a gambler doubling down rather than a man playing safe. He would leave the capital. He took with him the greater part of his force. Accounts differ on the exact count, but something on the order of 70 men, the more seasoned and battle-hardened of his soldiers, men he trusted to move fast and fight hard, and started east, back down the long causeway roads and through the mountain passes his small army had climbed only months before, back toward the coast and whatever waited there. He left behind, in the heart of Tenochtitlan, in the palace of Axayacatl where the Spanish had made their fortified quarters, a much smaller garrison, perhaps 80 men, perhaps closer to 120 depending on which chronicler you trust, a number small enough that it would have looked, to Mexican eyes watching from rooftops and canal-side markets, almost like a mistake, almost like an opening. Command of that garrison, and of Moctezuma himself, who remained under guard within the same walls, Cortés handed to a man named Pedro de Alvarado. If Cortés was calculation wrapped in charm, Alvarado was something rawer, golden-haired, striking enough that the Mexica had given him a name of his own, Tenacia, after the sun, for the way sunlight seemed to catch him, brave past question, and impatient in a way that would matter enormously in the weeks to come. He was well liked among the Spanish rank and file, a man other soldiers wanted beside them in a fight. Whether he was the right man to leave holding a hostage emperor and a garrison of 80 souls inside a city of hundreds of thousands, with the entire logic of the occupation resting on nerve and bluff rather than any real balance of force, that was a question Cortés did not have the luxury of dwelling on. He needed someone decisive at his back while he marched away, and decisiveness was the one thing Alvarado had never lacked. Down at Sempoala, among the Totonac allies who had been the very first people on this coast to defy Moctezuma and throw their lot in with the strangers, Cortés found Novaes' force already settled in, confident in its numbers, contemptuous of the exhausted, sun-darkened little band marching up to meet them. It should, by every reasonable measure, have been no contest at all. But numbers were never quite the whole of what decided these encounters. Cortés understood something Novaes did not trouble himself to learn, that soldiers a long way from home, newly arrived, unpaid beyond promises, serving a governor who had never set foot on this soil, could be talked to as easily as fought. He sent gold ahead, quietly, into the hands of Novaes' officers. He sent word that any man who joined him would share in the riches of a fallen empire rather than the empty glory of arresting a fellow Spaniard on a Caribbean governor's grudge. And when battle came, on a rain-soaked night with lightning breaking over the coastal plain, it was less a clash of armies than a swift, almost surgical seizure, Cortés's smaller, harder force striking in darkness, Novaes himself wounded and losing an eye in the fighting, captured within the hour. By morning, the men who had sailed from Cuba to end Hernando Cortés's career found themselves instead absorbed into it, folded into his ranks, their weapons, their horses, their cannon, and very nearly all of their soldiers now marching under his banner instead. It was, on its face, a triumph almost too complete to believe, a rival army neutralized without a prolonged war, and Cortés's own force suddenly multiplied many times over, swollen with fresh men eager for the gold they had heard filled the temples of Tenochtitlan. He had gambled everything on leaving the capital, and the gamble at the coast had paid out beyond what even he could have hoped. But triumph in one place does not pause the clock in another. While Cortés stood among the captured ships and the newly sworn soldiers at Zempoala, turning over in his mind how quickly he might now march this larger force back toward the valley, word was already beginning to travel the other direction, runners moving fast along the same roads he had taken east, carrying news out of Tenochtitlan that had nothing to do with rival Spaniards or captured governors. Something had happened inside the city while its conqueror was away. Something involving Pedro de Alvarado, and a festival, and a courtyard full of dancers who had gathered, as they did every year at this season, to honor gods far older than any god the strangers had brought with them across the sea. What exactly had happened there, the messengers reaching Cortés could not yet fully say, only that the city he had left in careful, uneasy balance was, in his absence, balanced no longer. Let the city breathe again for a moment, because in the third week of May, in the year the Spanish called 1520, Tenochtitlan believed it had reason to breathe easy. Cortés was gone, marched east with most of his soldiers to deal with the rival expedition landing at the coast, and the man he had left behind to hold the palace of Axiacatl was a captain named Pedro de Alvarado, golden-haired, quick to laugh, quick to anger, a man the Mexica had already given a name of their own, Tenacia, after the sun, for the way the light caught him. He commanded perhaps 80 Spaniards and a handful of Tlaxcalan allies, a small garrison in a city of hundreds of thousands, and for weeks that imbalance had sat uneasily on him, a held breath he could not quite release. Then came Tenochtitlan. It was one of the great fixed points of the Mexica ritual year, a festival honoring Huitzilopochtli in his youthful aspect, and it had been observed in that courtyard for longer than anyone living could remember, long before any Spaniard had set foot on this shore. For weeks a young man chosen to embody the god had walked the causeways dressed in fine cloth, attended, admired, living out his brief season of glory before the ending the role required. Now the season had turned. Now came the dancing, hundreds, by some accounts closer to 1,000, of the city's most honored people, warriors who had distinguished themselves in battle, young nobles from the Karmikak schools, the flower of Tenochtitlan's aristocracy, gathered in the walled courtyard of the Templo Mayor in their finest ornaments, gold at their wrists and their ears, precious feathers nodding above their heads, moving together in the old steps to drums that had kept this rhythm for generations. They had asked Alvarado's permission to hold the festival, and by every account he had given it. And crucially, this is the detail that would matter more than any other before the day was through, they had come unarmed. It was not a warrior's occasion. It was a dancer's occasion, a singer's occasion, and so the men who might otherwise have carried the strength of the city on their shoulders stood instead in borrowed splendor, empty-handed, given over entirely to the rhythm of the drums. What passed through Alvarado's mind as he watched them gather, no one can now recover with certainty, and the sources that survive, Spanish and Nahua alike, written years later, colored by grief on one side and by the need for justification on the other, do not agree on where the truth settled. Some said he had been warned, or believed he had been warned, that the dance was cover for a rising, that armed men waited beyond the walls to fall on his small garrison the moment it let its guard down, that the empty hands he saw before him were empty only for show. Others said there was no plot at all, only a captain's fear working alone in a city that outnumbered him 1,000 to 1, a fear that needed no conspiracy to become unbearable. And still others pointed to something plainer and uglier, the gold. The dancers were dressed in it, wound with it, and gold was the one appetite that had followed every Spaniard across the ocean and never once loosened its grip. Whatever moved him, Alvarado acted with a speed that left no room for the courtyard to save itself. He posted men at every gate. He sealed the walls the dancers had walked through so freely an hour before. And then, at his order, the soldiers who had waited quietly at the festival's edges, men who by tradition had come as guests, as tolerated onlookers to a rite not their own, turned inward on the crowd with steel. Picture it only as far as you need to, and then let the image soften, the way memory softens what it cannot hold too long, drums that do not stop at once, because the musicians at the center of the courtyard cannot yet see what is happening at its edges. Feathers scattering. The particular helplessness of hands that had been raised in dance and had nothing else to raise. The high stone walls that had been built, ironically, to hold a sacred space apart from the ordinary city, walls that now did their work too well, holding everything inside with nowhere to run. In under an hour, by the accounts that survive, a substantial part of Tenochtitlan's warrior nobility, men who had led companies into battle, men being groomed for the highest offices of the city, lay dead in the courtyard where they had gone only to honor their god as their fathers had. Alvarado would later tell Cortés that he had struck first to prevent a slaughter of his own men, and it is possible he believed this absolutely, the way a frightened man in a foreign city, cut off from support, surrounded by a language he barely understood, can talk himself into striking before he is struck. It is possible, too, that fear and greed simply walked into the courtyard together and no one bothered to separate them afterward. What can be said without much doubt is this: whatever the reasoning, the result was not the neutralizing of a threat but the manufacturing of one, absolute and immediate, where none of that scale had existed an hour before. News of what had happened in the sacred precinct did not stay inside those walls any more than the drumming had. It moved through the city the way water moves through a place built on water, fast, and finding every channel at once. Grief in Tenochtitlan that spring was not a private thing to be carried quietly to bed, it was a public wound, and the families of the dead were not distant strangers to one another but the interlinked houses of the ruling class itself, bound by marriage, by lineage, by decades of shared service to the city. By nightfall the anger had a shape, and the shape was rising. Men who had held back through months of uneasy coexistence, who had watched Moctezuma detained in the palace, who had swallowed insult after insult for the sake of avoiding exactly this kind of ruin, now found that restraint no longer had anywhere to attach itself. Weapons that had been set aside were taken up again. Barricades began to rise across streets that had, until that afternoon, still carried the ordinary traffic of a great capital going about its business. Inside the palace of Axayacatl, Alvarado and his small garrison found themselves, by the following day, no longer administrators of an uneasy peace but defenders under siege, the very outcome, some said, that his violence in the courtyard had been meant to prevent, arriving anyway, only now certain instead of merely feared. Somewhere on the road from the coast, a much larger Spanish column was turning back toward the valley with every day that passed, its commander still working from rumor and half-formed messages, not yet knowing exactly what he would find when the causeways came into view again, only that the city he had left behind, however carefully balanced, would not be balanced when he returned to it. The road back into the valley was quiet in a way that Cortés did not trust. He had crossed the mountains with his force nearly doubled now, his own battered company merged with the soldiers he had taken, days before, from a rival Spanish expedition sent to arrest him, men who had arrived on the coast to stop him and had ended the encounter marching under his banner instead. Something over 1,000 Spaniards now, perhaps 1,300, moving alongside several thousand Tlaxcalan warriors who had thrown their fortunes in with the strangers rather than face the old enemy alone. It was, on paper, the largest force he had yet brought to this city. And still, climbing toward the rim of the valley where the lake and its causeways would first come into view, he could not shake the sense that arriving in strength would not be the same as arriving in safety. The first causeway told him almost everything. No canoes drifting near the edges to sell fish or flowers. No porters. No children. The great avenue of water that had once been so busy it seemed to hum was empty in the particular way water goes empty when a city has decided, deliberately, to starve whoever crosses it. His allies noticed too, the Tlaxcalans especially, who knew this valley's rhythms better than any Spaniard ever would, and who read the stillness the way a sailor reads a flattened sea before a storm. They were not stopped. That was almost the strangest part. Cortés led his column across the southern causeway and in through the streets toward the old palace of Axiacatl unopposed, boots and hooves loud against stone in a capital that offered no fight and no welcome either, only closed doors, cold hearths glimpsed through open gates, and the occasional distant figure watching from a rooftop before withdrawing out of sight. It was the silence of a city that had already decided what it thought of him, and saw no need to spend its strength on a battle it could win more patiently, by simply waiting him out behind walls, with nothing coming in and no one going out. Only when the gates of the palace complex swung shut behind the column, and the count was taken, and the exhausted garrison that had been holding the compound since the massacre in the courtyard came stumbling out to meet the relief force with something between relief and disbelief on their faces, did the shape of it become clear. Alvarado and his men had survived. But they had survived as prisoners in every sense but the word, food dwindling, water drawn from a well inside the compound because nothing could be fetched from outside, the dead from the fighting still being tallied, and beyond the walls a city that had cut every thread of supply the moment the killing in the temple precinct had ended. Cortés had marched an army across a mountain range to relieve a siege, and arrived to find the siege was still very much in progress, only now he and his 1,300 were inside it with everyone else. It is worth pausing here, in the dim of the palace's inner rooms, on the particular strangeness of what happened next. Because somewhere within those walls, guarded and largely unseen by the ordinary business of the compound, Moctezuma was still living. Still dressed, by some accounts, in the manner befitting his rank. Still attended, after a fashion, by servants who had not entirely abandoned the forms of the old court even as everything the court had once meant was dissolving in the street outside. And Cortés, arriving furious and travel-worn after weeks of forced marches and one battle already fought and won against his own countrymen, went to see him. Picture it slowly, the way sleep allows you to picture things, not as spectacle, but as two men in a low-lit room, each changed by the month since they had last spoken. Moctezuma had once been approached only with eyes lowered, addressed only in the most careful and elevated language, carried rather than walked when he crossed any distance of consequence, so sacred in the ordering of his world that commoners were said to have built entire habits of avoidance around simply not looking at him directly. That was less than a year gone. And in that low room, whatever remained of it was theatre now, a memory of protocol performed by a man who had spent months as a captive inside his own capital, whose voice, when he had tried to use it, calling out from a rooftop days earlier, urging his own people to stand down, had been met not with the old reflexive reverence but with stones, and arrows, and the open scorn of a crowd that no longer recognized, in the man they saw, the ruler they had once served. That is the detail worth sitting with here, gently, before the mind lets go of it for the night. A king cannot rule from inside another power's grip and expect to be believed. The city outside these walls had watched Moctezuma stand beside the men who held him captive, urging patience, urging calm, urging exactly the kind of restraint that had failed to prevent a massacre only days before, and the city had drawn its own conclusion. Whatever mattered had passed to someone else. Perhaps to his brother Cuitlahuac, already moving through the wards and Calpulli councils gathering the anger into something with edges. Perhaps simply to the collective will of a population that no longer needed a single figure to tell it what came next. Cortés, for his part, seems to have grasped only slowly how completely the ground had shifted. He had returned expecting, perhaps, to resume the arrangement that had more or less held for months, the emperor as a kind of hostage guarantor, useful, biddable, a name that still carried enough weight in the city to keep the peace even under duress. What he found instead was a man whose name, spoken now in the streets outside, drew not obedience but fury. The palace that had once been merely a residence under careful watch had become, in every practical sense, a fortress holding a monarch that his own kingdom had already begun to unmake. Outside, the market stayed shut. No maize came in along the causeways, no fish, no firewood, none of the 1,000 small transactions that had once kept tens of thousands fed in a city built on a lake with no fields of its own inside its walls. Cortés had more soldiers now than at any point since his arrival in the valley, and less food, less water, less room to maneuver, and less time than he yet understood. Somewhere beyond the palace gates, in wards he could no longer walk through freely, a new leadership was forming among the Mexica, one that owed the strangers nothing and Moctezuma even less. And within those walls, in the quiet after the reunion, a question was already settling over the compound like the dust that drifted down from the rafters at night, not whether the city would move against them, but simply how long the waiting would last before it did. Somewhere near midday on the 29th of June, 1520, a small procession climbed the stairway inside the palace of Axayacatl toward the flat roof above the courtyard, a roof that had, weeks before, held gardens and aviaries, a place where a Mexica emperor might once have stood simply to feel the wind off the lake. Now it held soldiers in half armor, sweating in the highland sun, and at the center of them, walking slowly, the man they still called Moctezuma, though the word Tlatoani had already begun to lose its meaning around him. He wore the turquoise diadem. He wore the cloak of authority. And he was, by every account that survives, a prisoner being asked to perform a kindness for his captors. Below the roofline, the plaza and the surrounding streets had filled with a crowd that no longer resembled the orderly, watchful Mexica who had greeted the strangers 8 months before. These were warriors now, and behind them, ordinary residents of the city carrying whatever could be thrown, stones pulled from half-built causeway repairs, fragments of temple masonry, the debris of a city that had begun, in its fury, to consume itself for ammunition. Cuauhtémoc, Moctezuma's brother and the lord of Iztapalapa, had returned from the failed embassy days before and had not stopped organizing since. The war leadership of Tenochtitlan had passed, in practice if not yet in title, into hands that answered to no one inside the palace walls. Cortés believed, or told himself he believed, that the old magic still worked, that if the crowd saw their emperor alive, unharmed, urging peace, the anger would drain out of the day the way it always had before. He had Moctezuma brought to the parapet. Attendants raised a gilded shield to catch the sun and mark him as who he was, so there could be no mistake about the man standing above them. And Moctezuma, whatever remained in him of the will to rule, spoke down into that sea of faces, asking, according to the Spanish who stood close enough to hear him, for the fighting to stop, for the strangers to be allowed to leave the city in peace. What happened in the next few minutes is one of those places where the surviving record splits cleanly in two, and it is worth sitting with that split rather than smoothing it over, because both halves were written by people who had reasons to shape what they remembered. The Spanish chroniclers, Cortés himself in his letters to the crown, and later Benal Diaz, who had stood in that courtyard as a young soldier and lived to write his account decades afterward, described a crowd that quieted for a moment, uncertain, and then erupted. Some among the throng, they wrote, did not believe the man on the roof was truly free, or truly speaking his own mind, or perhaps did not care. Stones and darts rose from the crowd. Moctezuma was struck, by one account 3 times, on the head and the arm, and he collapsed on the rooftop before his own attendants could shield him. He lingered for some days afterward, in this telling, refusing food, refusing the priests the Spanish brought to try to convert him even as he lay dying, and finally succumbed to his wounds. In this version, the death was a tragedy of crowd and confusion, a ruler killed, however unintentionally, by the fury of the very people he had once governed. The Nahuatl accounts gathered a generation later, testimony collected from Mexica elders and eyewitnesses by the Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagun, preserved in what became known as the Florentine Codex, tell a colder story. In this telling, the crowd's rage was real, but Moctezuma's death was not simply its accident. Some of these informants suggested that once it was clear the emperor could no longer command obedience, could no longer be useful as a shield or a mouthpiece, the Spanish themselves killed him inside the palace, along with several other captive nobles, and put the body out afterward to be found, his death folded into the chaos of the siege so that no one hand could be blamed for it. Other Nawa sources are less direct but equally suspicious of the official story, noting simply that a beloved or at least legitimate ruler had gone up onto that roof and never truly come down again, in body or in standing. There is no way, this far from that afternoon, to resolve the two accounts into a single certain truth, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. What can be said is that a man who once commanded the wealth of 100 subject cities died within the walls of a palace not his own, among captors who no longer needed him, in front of a city that had stopped listening to his voice days or weeks before his body stopped breathing. However the final blow arrived, Moctezuma's authority had already been spent long before it was tested on that rooftop. He had become, in the eyes of his own people, a man speaking someone else's words. His body, when the Spanish finally released it, was carried out by Mexica hands, but not to the state funeral a Tlatoani might once have expected. Accounts differ here too, some say it was left for common burial, others that his ashes were later kept in a modest, guarded place, quietly, without the vast ceremony that would ordinarily mark the death of one who ruled the Mexica world. There is a particular sorrow in that detail, whichever version is closer to true, a man born to inherit the grandest title in the valley, dying without the funeral his birth had promised him. What followed happened with startling speed, because the Mexica could not afford the luxury of a long mourning. Within days, some sources say almost immediately, the council of nobles turned to Cuauhtémoc, the brother who had already been leading the resistance in every way but name, and confirmed him as Tlatoani. There was no lengthy interregnum, no uncertain drift of power such as had followed other successions in Mexica history. The city needed a war leader more than it needed ceremony, and Cuauhtémoc had already proven, in the weeks of fighting through the streets and along the causeways, that he intended to finish what his brother's long patience had never allowed to begin. Where Moctezuma had hosted the strangers, listened to them, tried at every turn to absorb them into the old order of gifts and obligations, Cuauhtémoc had watched that order collapse and drawn a different conclusion, that these men were not guests to be managed but an infection to be driven from the body of the city before it spread any further. Inside the palace of Axayacatl, word of the succession reached Cortés and his captains within hours, carried by the same restless quiet that had settled over the compound since the reunion with Novaez's men. It told them plainly what they had perhaps already begun to suspect, that whatever leverage Moctezuma's captivity had once given them was gone now, buried with him, and that the man who now held the obsidian scepter of Tenochtitlan owed them nothing at all, not patience, not food, not one more day inside these walls. Somewhere out past the causeways, in the gathering dark, preparations were already underway that the Spanish would not fully understand until the night itself arrived. The rain came first. Not the soft rain of ordinary nights but a steady, drumming downpour that had begun in the late afternoon and had not let up by midnight, and Cortés would later say it was the one mercy of that night, that the noise of it covered the sound of hundreds of men easing out through a breach broken in the compound's western wall. Inside the palace of Axayacatl, in the last hours of the 30th of June, 1,500 Spanish soldiers and some 6,000 Tlaxcalan allies made their final preparations by torchlight, moving quietly, wrapping cloth around sword hilts and horse hooves, gathering what could be carried and abandoning what could not. And it was here, in this last gathering, that greed did what no Mexica warrior had yet managed. It began to kill Spaniards before a single blow had landed. Cortés allowed each man to take gold from Moctezuma's treasury, but he warned them, gently, the way a father warns a child he already knows will not listen: take only what you can carry and still run, still swim, still climb. The old soldiers, the veterans of Cortés's own company, took a little and left the rest. The newer men, Novaez's men, who had marched inland with visions of easy riches and had seen almost none of it yet, filled their doublets and their pockets and their boots with as much as they could hold, and some of them did not live to see the sun rise on the 1st of July, because when the moment came to run, or swim, or climb, they could not. The plan itself was simple, and like so many simple plans it depended entirely on the world holding still long enough to be executed. They would leave in the deepest part of the night, cross the shortest of the 3 great causeways, the one running west to Tacuba, and be clear of the city and its lake before the population woke to stop them. The causeway itself was solid enough, wide as a modern road, but the Mexican engineers who built it had cut gaps into it at intervals, portable wooden bridges spanning each channel so that canoes could pass beneath, and those bridges could be pulled up from either side to seal the causeway in sections, turning it from a road into a trap. Cortés knew this. He had crossed it enough times to have counted the gaps. And so his carpenters had built a single portable bridge of their own, a heavy timber span meant to be carried at the front of the column, laid across each gap, walked over, then hauled up again and carried forward to the next. It was, on paper, a reasonable solution to a known problem. What it did not account for was what happened when 1,500 frightened men and 6,000 allies, strung out along a causeway barely wide enough for 10 abreast, try to move a single heavy bridge backward through a crowd that is already moving forward, in the dark, in the rain, while people are dying around them. And that is more or less what happened, somewhere close to the first canal gap, in the small hours of the morning. A woman fetching water, some accounts say, or a sentry posted at the palace breach, no one is entirely certain who first raised the alarm, only that within minutes of the column's departure, a woman's voice was screaming a warning across the rooftops, and then the great drum atop the Templo Mayor began to sound, a deep, carrying note that every soul in the Valley of Mexico would have recognized as a call to war. The lake, which had seemed empty and still when the column set out, was suddenly not empty at all. Canoes came out from between the buildings on either side of the causeway, dozens of them and then hundreds, low dark shapes crewed by warriors who needed no torchlight to find their targets, because the column itself, strung out along the raised stone road with nowhere to hide, was the easiest target any army had ever been handed. Close your eyes and imagine, if you can bear to, not the battle itself but the sound of it, the drum from the temple, steady and enormous, carrying over the water, the wet slap of paddles, the whistle and thud of javelins and stones finding men who had nowhere to run but forward or back along a road 3 men could barely walk abreast on, and beneath all of it, water, always water, the lake pressing in on both sides of a causeway that had never felt so narrow. The portable bridge reached the first gap and was laid down, and the column began to cross, but a bridge built to carry infantry was never going to bear the weight of the column behind it, the horses, the cannon, the baggage train, 6,000 allies pressing forward from behind with the same fear driving them that was driving the Spanish, and somewhere in that crush, the bridge cracked, or slipped, or simply could not be freed from the mud and stone it had wedged itself into, and it would not come up again. Which meant that everyone behind that first gap, perhaps 2/3 of the entire column, now had only the gap itself between them and the far side, no bridge, canoes on either flank, and a rising tide of men pressing from the rear who did not yet understand why the column ahead of them had stopped moving. What followed was not so much a battle as a slow, terrible filling in. Men went into the gap in 2s and 3s at first, then by the dozen, until, soldiers who survived the night would say later, with the flat disbelief of men describing something they still could not quite credit, the gap filled with bodies and baggage and drowned or drowning horses until those still on the causeway could cross on top of them, walking, however briefly, on the men who had gone in just moments before. The gold did what Cortés had warned it would do. Men who had filled their clothing with treasure in the palace that evening sank the instant they touched water and did not come up again, dragged under by the very fortune they had refused to leave behind. It was at one of these gaps, accounts differ on which, that Pedro de Alvarado made the leap that would follow him for the rest of his life. Cut off, his horse killed beneath him, the bridge gone and the crossing choked with the dead, he is said to have set the point of his lance or a length of timber into the wreckage below and vaulted the gap in a single motion, landing on the far side alive while men on both sides of him did not. Whether it happened exactly as the story tells it, no one now living can say with certainty. Memory is its own kind of current, and it also drags things under and reshapes what it lets back to the surface, but the Mexican who watched it happen gave the place a name that outlasted the empire itself, Alvarado's Leap. He would carry the memory of that night for the rest of his days, and so, in their own way, would all of them. By the time grey light began to touch the rain clouds over the lake, the column that reached the shore at Tacuba was a fraction of the one that had left the palace hours before. Cortés is said to have sat beneath a great cypress tree on the far shore and wept, and the tree stands there still, called by some the tree of the sad night, though what exactly passed through his mind in that hour, grief, calculation, or something that was already, quietly, becoming a plan for return, is a thing the record does not tell us, and never will. The road north from Tacuba was not a road at all in the way the word suggests: order, direction, ease of passage. It was a scar cut through unfamiliar country by several hundred frightened, wounded people moving as fast as failing bodies would allow, circling wide around the northern arm of the lake because the causeways behind them were lost and the water itself had become an enemy. You can imagine the quality of that walking, not marching, walking, the kind where each step is negotiated with a body that has already given most of what it had. Men carried gold in soaked doublets until the weight became unbearable and then let it go, quietly, without ceremony, into the mud, because by the second day gold had stopped meaning anything at all. What mattered was water, and shade, and the growing, sick awareness that the empire they had wounded was not finished with them yet. They passed through small towns whose names barely survive in the record: Tenochtitlan, Tlatelolco, places that gave what food they had, sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of the simple human reflex to feed the desperate, though every one of those towns owed its allegiance, at least nominally, to Tenochtitlan, and every one of those towns must have sent word ahead. Because it was already known, by the fourth day, that somewhere before them, in the open country near Otumba, an answer was gathering. Not an ambush in the forest, nothing so quiet. A field army. Numbers that the chroniclers who lived through it would later describe in the kind of language people use when they are trying to convey not a count but an impression: the plain white with cotton armor, the low hills suddenly moving, the sensation of the earth itself being crowded out by bodies. By the morning of the 7th of July, 1520, the remnant of Cortés's force, perhaps 400 Spaniards left of the 1,200 who had entered the city months before, and a diminished company of Tlaxcalan allies who had marched with them out of loyalty and now had every reason to abandon them, came down into open ground near Otumba and found the road ahead simply gone, replaced by an army that some estimates place in the tens of thousands, arrayed with the discipline of a state that still, even after everything, believed absolutely in its own permanence. There was no flanking this. There was no retreat that led anywhere but into more of the same. The exhausted column had, in effect, been allowed to walk itself into a closed hand. What happened next belongs to that rare and uncomfortable category of history that reads, honestly, like invention, a moment so improbable that historians have spent 5 centuries checking it against every surviving source, only to keep finding it confirmed from more than one angle. Cortés, whatever else may be said of him, understood something in that hour that his enemies, for all their numbers, had not accounted for, that a Mesoamerican army fought under the authority of its commanders in a very particular way, each one marked, each one visible, carrying insignia that told every warrior on the field exactly where the center of the battle's meaning stood. And on that field, somewhere in the churn of feathered banners, rode a commander bearing the great standard of gold and quetzal feather that marked him as the one who held the army's cohesion in his own person. Cortés gathered what mounted men he still had, a bare handful, perhaps no more than 5, the last horses that had survived the causeway and the retreat, thin and lathered and barely able to charge, but still, on that field, the one thing the Aztec forces had never faced before in open country. And instead of trying to hold a line that could not be held against such numbers, he did something closer to a gamble than a strategy. He pointed his horsemen directly at the standard, at the man who carried it, cutting through the press of warriors toward that single visible point of authority. It should not have worked. A handful of exhausted riders against a sea of men should have been swallowed within minutes. But they reached him. The commander fell, the standard came down, and for a moment that the survivors would describe afterward with something like disbelief, the enormous army arrayed against them seemed to lose, all at once, the thread that had been holding it together, because in that style of warfare, the fall of the standard was not a tactical loss but something closer to a sudden absence of meaning, the collapse of the very thing the battle had been organized around. Warriors who a moment before had been pressing forward hesitated, turned to look, began, in scattered pockets, to fall back. And a retreat that starts in a few small places has a way of becoming, very quickly, a retreat everywhere. It is worth resting here a moment, in the strangeness of it, how a single fallen banner could undo tens of thousands, how history sometimes turns not on the larger truth of numbers or cause but on one narrow, physical fact, a rider reaching a man before that man's own guard closed around him. The battered column did not linger to understand its own survival. They gathered what was left of themselves and kept moving, and within days the land began, slowly, to soften around them, the hostile fields giving way at last to the territory of Tlaxcala, the old ally who had never fully trusted Tenochtitlan and had bled alongside the Spaniards since the earliest days of the alliance. What happened at Tlaxcala in the days that followed was its own kind of quiet drama, argued in council rather than on a battlefield, but no less consequential. There were voices among the Tlaxcalan lords who looked at the ruin that had staggered into their territory, starving, wounded, stripped of the gold and the confidence that had marked them only months before, and asked, reasonably enough, why any further loyalty was owed to a cause that had so plainly failed. It would have cost the Tlaxcalans little, in that hour, to close their gates, or worse. But the old Lord Xicotencatl and others who had come to see their own future bound to this fight against Tenochtitlan chose otherwise. The survivors were sheltered, fed, allowed to rest inside walls that, for the first time in weeks, did not need to be watched all night for movement in the dark. They rested there through the summer, tending wounds that would leave scars for the rest of their lives, while somewhere behind them, in the city they had fled, the Mexica were already returning to their ordinary rhythms of harvest and repair, believing, not unreasonably, that the invaders were finished. But rest, in this story, is never quite what it appears to be, and even as the survivors slept safely within Tlaxcala's walls that summer, something else, smaller than an army, and far more patient, was already moving through the valley toward the same lake, the same causeways, the same crowded island city, carried in the breath and belongings of people who had no way of knowing what they carried at all. It had no drums, no banners, no war cries to announce its arrival. It moved the way smoke moves through a house with its windows open, following no road, needing no permission, slipping in wherever there was breath to carry it and skin to receive it. Historians would later trace its likely origin to a single man, perhaps one of the African auxiliaries who had come ashore with Panfilo de Novaes' expedition months earlier, a man who may not have even known he was ill, or who died of it quietly and was buried without anyone understanding what his body had just done to a continent. Smallpox had crossed the Atlantic before, in the holds of ships, in the folds of blankets, in the simple, unthinking traffic of an old world reaching for a new one. And now, in the closing months of 1520, it reached the Valley of Mexico, where a population of perhaps 20 million people had lived for centuries without ever once meeting this particular enemy, and so carried no memory in their bodies of how to fight it. You have to understand what that absence meant. In Europe, smallpox was cruel, but it was known, a disease that had already claimed its share of children in every generation, leaving the survivors marked, and, crucially, immune. It was a monster the old world had bled against for 1,000 years, until enough of its population carried some resistance, inherited or acquired, that it became merely a horror instead of an apocalypse. The Mexica had no such scar tissue. Every immune system in the Valley of Mexico met this virus as something entirely new, and a virus meeting a population with zero prior immunity does not behave like an ordinary illness. It does not sicken a fraction and spare the rest. It moves through a household and takes the parents beside the children, the strong beside the frail, the healers beside the ones they are trying to heal. Mortality estimates from what came to be called the Coccolistli, the pestilence, in the accounts left by Nahua writers and Spanish chroniclers alike, ran catastrophically high, by some tellings, a third to a half of everyone it touched. It reached Tenochtitlan sometime in the late autumn, arriving in a city already exhausted by the departure of the Spanish, already grieving the dead of the Causeway battles, already trying to remember what an ordinary week felt like. And into that fragile recovery, the sickness spread with the terrible efficiency of a city built for closeness, canals and footbridges and shared courtyards, families sleeping several to a room, the very density that had made Tenochtitlan a marvel of engineering now becoming the corridor through which the virus traveled from one body to the next. It did not choose its victims by rank. Priests who tended the sick fell sick themselves. Warriors who had survived the Causeway fighting with their bodies whole succumbed within days to a fever no blade could parry. The pustules came first, then the fever, then, for so many, a swiftness of decline that left barely time to say goodbye. Bernardino de Sahagun's informants, gathering testimony decades later from those who remembered, described bodies that could not be moved without the skin coming away, streets where the smell of the dead outpaced anyone's ability to bury them, houses where every single person inside had died and no one remained to carry the news to a neighbor. Try, for a moment, to imagine the ordinary logic of a city breaking down not through conquest but through absence. The market stalls of Tlatelolco, some of them, simply stopped opening, because the family that ran them was gone. The canals that carried fresh produce in from the Chinampas went quieter, because the farmers who tended those floating gardens were dying in numbers that made the harvest, for a season, almost beside the point. Midwives who had delivered half the infants in a district were themselves gone within the same week their patients fell ill. This was not the visible catastrophe of a burning temple or a captured causeway. It was a slower, stranger unraveling, the quiet disappearance, house by house, of the people who knew how a city worked, who remembered which canal needed clearing, who could set a fracture, who could lead a prayer, who simply knew everyone's names. And into the middle of this came the death of a man barely settled into his throne. Cuauhtémoc, brother of Moctezuma, had been raised to the position of Tlatoani in the desperate days after the Spanish were driven from the city, chosen precisely because he was decisive where his brother had hesitated, because he had argued for resistance when others counseled accommodation, because the city needed, above all else, a leader who would not waver. He had barely begun to govern. He had barely finished organizing the city's defenses, barely begun the diplomatic work of holding the empire's tributary states loyal against the whispers coming from Tlaxcala. Some accounts suggest he was, in these weeks, actively planning how to prevent the Spanish and their allies from ever regrouping at the lake's edge, a Tlatoani thinking in terms of causeways and garrisons and the coming dry season. And then, after somewhere close to 80 days on the mat of rulership, the fever took him too. No battle claimed him. No enemy blade found him. He died the way tens of thousands of his people were dying that same season, in a bed, in a fever, in a body that had never had the chance to learn how to fight what was killing it. Consider what is lost when a leader dies not in defeat but in disruption, not because his strategy failed, but because the disease did not care what his strategy was. Tenochtitlan lost, in that single death, not only its ruler but the continuity of command at the exact moment continuity mattered most. A new Tlatoani would have to be chosen, and chosen quickly, from among a council that was itself being thinned by the same sickness, in a city too weakened even to properly mourn. It is worth sitting with the strange, quiet enormity of this, an empire that had turned back a European invasion in open battle just months before, that had, by every measure of the crossbow and the sword, one, found itself brought lower not by the invaders' weapons but by something the invaders had not even meant to bring, something no strategist on either side had accounted for, something that made the Causeway battles look, in hindsight, almost survivable by comparison. And so the city that had celebrated survival that summer entered the autumn diminished in a way no siege could have managed so quickly. The population that would need to defend Tenochtitlan when the enemy eventually returned, and he would return, was not the same population that had driven him out. It was smaller. It was grieving. It was leaderless, for a time, in the space between one Tlatoani's death and the next one's raising. Somewhere in Tlaxcala, meanwhile, the survivors of that flight were healing, resting, gathering strength inside walls the sickness had not yet reached in the same measure, though it would touch them too, in time, sparing no one entirely. But for now, in the city on the lake, the question was no longer only whether Tenochtitlan could withstand another army. It was whether there would be enough of Tenochtitlan left, when that army came, to mount a defense at all, and whether the young man about to be raised to the mat of rulership in the sickness's aftermath would have any city left worth ruling. The mat of Tenochtitlan does not stay empty for long, even when the hands meant to raise a new ruler onto it are exhausted from digging graves. Cuauhtémoc, who had led the city through the desperate nights of the Spaniards' flight and the triumph on the Causeway, wore the turquoise diadem for barely 80 days before the sickness that had swept through every ward and canal-side house took him too. And so the lords who remained, fewer of them now, the plague having no particular respect for rank, turned to a young man not yet 25, a nephew of Moctezuma, son of the old conquering Tlatoani Ahuetzotl, a man whose name meant, in the old tongue, something like a diving eagle, or an eagle that has descended. Cuauhtémoc. He had fought in the fighting on the causeways. He had watched the city drown its own dead in canals grown too clogged to paddle through. And now, in a hall that still smelled faintly of copal smoke and sickness, he was carried up to the throne his cousin and his uncle had so recently occupied, to rule a city that was, in every sense that mattered, wounded. Picture him there, if you can, in the dim gold light of the palace, receiving the ornaments of rulership from priests whose numbers, too, had thinned. The lip plug, the nose ornament of thin gold, the netted cloak reserved for the Tlatoani alone, all of it settling onto a young man who could not have failed to understand what he had actually inherited. Not the Tenochtitlan of the markets Cortés himself had once called the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. Not the city that had received a Spanish column across the causeway with flowers and music and a terrible, fatal courtesy. He inherited a city with its causeways broken in places from the fighting, its granaries thinned by siege and flight, its population reduced by disease in numbers no one could yet properly count, and grief sitting in nearly every household like a second resident. He inherited, too, the certain knowledge, because scouts and merchants carried word across the valley the way water finds its own level, that the pale strangers had not sailed home in defeat. They had only retreated to Tlaxcala. And they were, by every report reaching the city on the lake, not leaving. What Cuauhtémoc did with what he'd inherited says something about him, and it is worth lingering on, gently, the way you might turn a smooth stone over in your palm. He did not simply mourn. He set the city to work healing itself, in the practical, unglamorous ways that don't often survive in the more dramatic tellings of this history. Causeways were repaired. The wooden bridges that could be pulled up to break a crossing were reinforced and multiplied, so that Tenochtitlan's old advantage, a city on an island, reachable only by water or by narrow stone roads that could be cut in an instant, could be pressed harder than it had been before. Canoes were built or requisitioned in greater numbers, because if the war came again, it would very likely come partly across the water, and whoever controlled the lake's surface controlled how the battle unfolded. Weapons were gathered and made, obsidian-edged clubs, the macuahuatl, spears tipped with the same volcanic glass, javelins launched from throwing sticks, the deep stores of stones and slings that a city under threat learns to hoard the way a household hoards maize before a hard winter. And Cuauhtémoc worked, too, at something less visible than fortification. He worked at making a grieving population believe that grief was not the last word. That there was still a city to defend and still a reason to defend it. Tribute and allegiance were retired where they had frayed, though not everywhere, and this is where the story bends toward Tlaxcala, because while Cuauhtémoc mended his city, Cortés was, in his patient and calculating way, mending an army. He spent the better part of half a year in Tlaxcala, through the last warm months of 1 year and into the cold ones of the next, and he did not spend that time idle. Reinforcements arrived from Spanish Cuba and from the coast, drawn by rumor of gold and by the simple momentum of an enterprise that had not yet declared itself finished. Horses were replaced. Gunpowder and crossbow bolts were resupplied. And Cortés set his carpenters and shipwrights to a task that would have seemed, to anyone watching from the valley floor, almost mad in its ambition, building ocean-going brigantines, small armed sailing vessels, in a mountain town nowhere near the sea, meant eventually to be broken into pieces small enough for Tlaxcalan porters to carry over the passes and reassemble on the shore of the very lake Tenochtitlan sat upon. If the city's strength was water no army could easily cross, Cortés meant to bring the water itself under Spanish sail. But ships and steel were only part of it, and perhaps not even the larger part. Cortés spent those months also as a kind of patient diplomat, though diplomacy is a gentle word for what was really an unpicking of an empire from the inside. The Valley of Mexico was not, and had never quite been, a single united people standing behind Tenochtitlan out of love. It was a patchwork of city-states and tributary towns, Texcoco, Chalco, Xochimilco, and dozens more, many of them bound to the Mexica by tribute obligations that chafed, by old grievances, by conquered pride that had simply been waiting, for a generation or two, for the right moment to be repaid. Cortés understood this, or learned it quickly enough, and he courted those grievances the way you might coax a banked fire back to flame, carefully, patiently, feeding it exactly what it needed. Emissaries went back and forth. Promises were made about tribute lifted, about old scores settled, about a future in which Tenochtitlan's dominance over the valley was simply no longer the arrangement anyone had to live under. Some towns came over slowly. Some, watching which way the wind seemed to be blowing, came over all at once. So while Cuauhtémoc raised new bridges and counted his remaining canoes and tried to teach a grieving city to believe in itself again, the war being prepared against him was not only a war of soldiers and horses and the strange thunder of Spanish guns. It was a war being fought, piece by piece, in the loyalties of towns that ringed his own lake, towns whose canoes and warriors and knowledge of every shallow and current Cortés would soon need very badly indeed. Somewhere in those Tlaxcalan workshops, timber was already being shaped into hulls that had never touched water. And somewhere closer to home, in towns Cuauhtémoc might once have called subjects, some quiet calculation was already turning, about which side those towns wished to be standing on when the water finally ran red. Let the timber tell its own story first, because before it was anything else, it was simply trees, pine felled in the cool highlands above Tlaxcala, hauled down by hands that had spent a generation learning to hate the empire on the lake, and shaped, plank by plank, under the direction of a man named Martín López. He was a ship's carpenter by trade, not a soldier, and if you had asked him a year earlier what he expected to be doing with his life, building a fleet of brigantines in a mountain workshop 400 miles from the nearest ocean would not have been the answer. But Cortés had understood something in the quiet after Tenochtitlan's causeways ran with Spanish blood, something almost embarrassingly simple once it was said aloud. The city that had broken him was safe only because it sat on water, and water could be met with ships. So the order went out, and López set to work through the closing months of 1520, cutting hulls in sections small enough for men to carry, numbering each timber like a puzzle meant to be solved 100 miles from where it was cut. 13 vessels in total. Small by the standards of the ocean crossings that had first brought these men to this coastline, but each one built to carry a cannon in its bow, a mast for sailing when the wind allowed, oars for when it didn't, and enough Spanish crossbowmen and gunners to turn any canoe that came near it into splinters. You might picture, if you're drifting somewhere between waking and sleep, the strange procession that followed once the pieces were ready, a line of Tlaxcalan porters stretching for miles along the mountain road, each carrying a plank or a rib or a coil of rigging, thousands of them moving in careful relay down from the workshops toward the Valley of Mexico, guarded the whole way by warriors who had their own scores to settle with the city at the lake's center. It took weeks. It was, by any honest measure, one of the strangest feats of the entire conquest, not a battle at all, but a migration of unfinished ships, carried on human shoulders through terrain that had never been meant for anything larger than a hunting party. At Texcoco, on the eastern shore, where Cortés had made his headquarters after the long, bitter retreat from the city, the pieces came together. A canal was dug, wide enough and deep enough to let the assembled hull slide from dry ground into the lake itself, and through the early months of 1521 the brigantines took their final shape there, 13 dark hulls rising on a shoreline where, not so long before, there had been only reeds and fishing canoes. It must have seemed almost absurd to the towns watching from a distance, foreigners building an armada in a lake basin, as though the mountains themselves might suddenly become an ocean. But absurd or not, it worked exactly as intended. Every canoe that had once carried maize and obsidian and armed warriors freely across the water, every hidden approach and quiet resupply that had kept Tenochtitlan alive through months of siege and rebellion, depended entirely on the water belonging to the city that stood on it. Cortés meant to take that belonging away. And so, in the last week of May 1521, the thing that had been assembling itself quietly for months finally moved. The brigantines were launched onto the lake under sail and altogether, 13 low, dark shapes cutting across water that had known only canoes for 2 centuries, and at almost the same hour the land forces began to move as well, Spanish infantry and cavalry, together with tens of thousands of allied warriors from Tlaxcala and Texcoco and towns whose names would rarely make it into the chronicles at all, advancing along each of the 3 great causeways that tied the island city to the shore. Iztapalapa to the south, Tacuba to the west, Tepeyac to the north. 3 roads, each one a spine of packed earth and stone laid across the shallows generations before any Spaniard had set foot in this valley, each one now a line that armed men intended to hold and never again let open. This was the moment the siege of Tenochtitlan properly began, not a raid, not a punitive expedition, but a closing. For the first time since the city's founding, water and land together turned against it at once. The brigantines swept the lake clear of the canoe fleets that had always been Tenochtitlan's true strength, its market boats and messenger boats and war canoes alike, forcing them back toward the island's edges or destroying them outright with cannon fire that must have sounded, to anyone standing on the causeways or the rooftops, like nothing the valley had ever produced. And along the causeways themselves, the armies dug in, cutting the roads at intervals so that even should the ship somehow fail, no army could simply march back and forth as the Spanish once had. Every gap in the water was covered. Every approach was watched. If you try to imagine the view from the city itself in those first days of the encirclement, imagine Cuauhtémoc somewhere on a high terrace, watching 13 ships move where he had never once had to think about defending water, because water had always simply belonged to Tenochtitlan the way sky belongs to a bird. It must have felt less like a battle beginning and more like a fact of the world quietly rearranging itself. The lake his grandfather's grandfather had built causeways across, the lake that fed and guarded and fattened the city, had just been turned into a wall against it. There would be no more easy resupply from the maize fields of the mainland, no more slipping messengers past a besieging army under cover of dark water. Everything the city needed now would have to come from within its own storehouses, or not come at all. And still, even sealed on 3 sides by soldiers and cut across the water by ships neither he nor his people had ever imagined a use for, Cuauhtémoc did not send word of surrender. Whatever calculations he had been making through the long months of rebuilding, whatever hope he still held that the causeways could be defended house by house if it came to that, none of it had broken yet. The city had lost the lake. It had not yet lost its will. And somewhere in the days just ahead, as the first Spanish attempts to push along the causeways met resistance far fiercer than anyone on the mainland had expected, that will was about to be tested in a way that would decide, street by street, just how long a city built on water could go on fighting once the water itself had turned against it. The water went first. Not the lake itself, that had already been lost, the causeway seized, the brigantines patrolling where canoes once ruled, but the sweet water, the drinking water, the thin clear thread that had run from the springs of Chapultepec along a stone aqueduct into the heart of the city since before most of the people now dying of thirst inside it had been born. Cortés understood, as clearly as any siege engineer ever has, that a city cannot be starved quickly but it can be dried quickly, and so in the second week of that long fighting summer, Spanish soldiers and their allies from Texcoco walked the length of the aqueduct with iron bars and hammers and broke it open, section by section, until the flow reversed and pooled uselessly in the earth outside the city rather than reaching the fountains and cisterns of Tenochtitlan. What had been a marvel, Spanish chroniclers themselves had marveled at it. This ribbon of fresh water carried on stone arches across brackish lake for miles, a feat their own engineers back home would have been proud to claim, became, in an afternoon, a wound. The people of the city turned to the lake itself, brackish and increasingly fouled by the dead, and to shallow wells dug in desperation near the temple precincts, water that made the drinker sicker rather than well. You can imagine, if you allow yourself to, what that thirst must have felt like laid on top of hunger that was already weeks old, the particular cruelty of living surrounded by water, lake water in every direction to the horizon, and none of it fit to drink. And into that thirst, that hunger, the fighting came closer, block by block, the way a tide comes in not all at once but in 100 small advances that only look sudden when you glance back at where the line used to be. The Spanish had learned, by early summer, that they could not simply march down the great causeways the way they had tried in the earlier campaign, when the Aztec had opened gaps in the roadway and let horses and men drown in the cuts between one section and the next. So the tactic changed, and it changed into something slower and, in its way, sadder than a cavalry charge. Cortés's allied forces, tens of thousands of Tlaxcalan and Texcocan and Xochimilcan warriors, men from cities that had suffered under Aztec tribute for generations and saw in this siege not conquest but reckoning, began to fill the canals. Not with earth carried from outside, there was no time and no way to bring it in fast enough, but with the city itself. They pulled down the houses along the captured edge of each conquered block, the stone and adobe and timber of ordinary homes, kitchens, workshops, and shoveled the rubble into the canal beside it until the water disappeared beneath a crude causeway of broken masonry, solid enough to walk artillery and horses across. Then they took the next block, and pulled that down too, and filled the next canal, and took the next block after that. A city built for 1,000 years on the principle that water moves between things, between houses, between temples, between market and home, was being methodically converted into dry, rubble-choked ground, one canal at a time, by the very people whose ancestors had helped build parts of it in tribute. Think of what that must have looked like from above, if anyone could have seen it from above, an expanding stain of grey wreckage spreading from the causeway edges inward, swallowing streets that had names, plazas where children had played, the homes of families whose descendants, if they survived at all, would never see those particular walls standing again. The Spanish who had ridden into this city 2 years earlier and stood in something close to awe, Benol Diaz would later write of soldiers who wondered if what they saw was real, so ordered and clean and vast the city had seemed beside anything in Europe they had known. Those same soldiers, or their comrades, were now among the men doing the pulling down. War does that. It takes the thing that impressed you and teaches you to see it only as material, only as cover for a sniper, only as an obstacle between you and the next canal. The fighting itself, in these weeks, had none of the drama of a single decisive battle and all of the grinding, wearing horror of urban combat, fought street by street against people with nothing left to lose. Warriors fought from rooftops, hurling stones and darts down onto the advancing column, then vanished into the maze of connecting passages before a countercharge could reach them. Ambushes came from doorways, from the tops of half-demolished temple platforms, from canals not yet filled where canoes could still slip close enough for a spear throw. The Spanish and their allies took the city almost literally house by house, and every house taken meant another house pulled down behind them to secure the ground, so that the advance and the destruction were, by midsummer, the same motion. Cortés himself would later claim he wept, or came close to it, watching what the siege was doing to a city he had once hoped to rule intact rather than inherit as rubble. Whether that grief was genuine or a flourish added for the benefit of the Spanish crown reading his reports afterward, historians still argue over, and perhaps it does not matter because the rubble did not care either way. What is certain, what every account from both sides agrees on, is that through all of it, the cut aqueduct, the vanishing food stores, the wells that sickened rather than nourished, the steady grey advance of broken buildings swallowing street after street, Cuauhtémoc did not send word of surrender. He was young, not yet 25 by most estimates, the last of a line of rulers stretching back further than anyone in that starving city could fully trace, and whatever else history would say of him, no one who was there ever accused him of losing his nerve. He moved between strong points, by canoe where canals still allowed it, rallying warriors who had not eaten a full meal in days, who were drinking water that made them ill, who could look in any direction and see less of their city standing than had stood the week before. He held them there anyway. Whether it was faith that the gods would still turn the tide, or simple refusal to hand victory to men who had already taken so much, or something closer to a private, unspoken understanding that surrender now would not actually spare his people any of what was coming, no one can say for certain what kept him standing in the wreckage rather than walking out to the Spanish camp with empty hands. But he stood. And so the summer went on that way, the aqueduct dry, the canals filling one by one with the bones of the city's own houses, the fighting compressing into a smaller and smaller island of streets still recognizably Tenochtitlan, and somewhere in that shrinking ground, in the smoke and the thirst and the refusal to bend, the final weeks of the siege were already beginning to take a shape that even Cuauhtémoc, watching his capital disappear beneath rubble one canal at a time, could not yet have fully measured. The district was called Tlatelolco, and by the second week of August it was the only ground left. Once it had been a city within the city, a market quarter so vast that Spanish soldiers who first saw it compared it, without exaggeration, to Rome or Constantinople, its plaza large enough to hold 60,000 people bartering feathers and cacao and gold in a single unhurried morning. Now it was rubble the height of a man in places, and the streets that had carried that commerce carried something else. The Nahuatl accounts gathered decades later by the Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagun, testimony taken directly from Mexica survivors who had lived through these final days, describe it plainly, without the softening a conqueror's chronicle might apply. The houses had their roofs pulled down for want of wood to burn. The canals, which for 2 centuries had carried flowers and fresh water and canoes stacked with maize, now carried the dead, because there was no one left with the strength to bury them and no ground left unclaimed by Spanish guns to bury them in. The people who remained ate what could not really be called food: lizards, the bark stripped from trees, the salt-crusted grass that grew at the lake's edge, ground into something that could be swallowed. Sahagun's informants remembered the color of the water in those last days more clearly than they remembered any battle: brown, then red, then a color that had no word attached to it in the accounts at all, because some things a person simply describes by falling silent. And still, somehow, it did not end. That is the detail worth resting on, before the ending comes, because it says something about what was actually happening in that last shrinking square of streets. This was not a garrison holding a line out of strategy. There was no strategy left that made sense. The men and women crowded into Tlatelolco knew, by every measure a rational person could apply, that the war was lost, had perhaps known it for weeks, watching the brigantines control the lake, watching the aqueduct stay dry, watching their own numbers thin by starvation faster than by Spanish steel. And they kept fighting anyway, in doorways and on rooftops, with weapons that had been fashioned from whatever the ruins still offered. Cortés himself, writing to the Spanish crown afterward, admitted a kind of bewilderment at it, that a people so plainly beaten would not simply stop. He did not have a word for what he was seeing either. Historians who came long after him have suggested a few, obligation, perhaps, to gods who had not yet withdrawn their claim on courage even if they had withdrawn everything else. Or simply the fact that surrender, by this point, promised no mercy worth the word. The massacres at Cholula and in the great temple courtyard were not distant memories but recent ones, and nobody in Tlatelolco believed laying down a spear would buy anything but a different kind of death. Cuauhtémoc held his court. If a ruined temple platform with no roof left over it can still be called a court, somewhere in the heart of that district, and by the 12th of August his advisers were telling him plainly that there was nothing further to be done from where they stood. Not surrender. Something else. A door still technically open, the lake itself. If the Emperor of the Mexica could be gotten out across the water, beyond the tightening net of brigantines, there was a chance, thin, but a chance, of regrouping somewhere the Spanish had not yet reached, of the resistance continuing in a different form, in a different place, under a ruler who was still alive to give it shape. It was not cowardice being proposed. It was the last available shape of hope. So on the morning of the 13th of August, 1521, a date that would be carried afterward in two entirely different registers of memory, one Spanish and triumphant, one Nahua and unbearably final, Cuauhtémoc stepped into a canoe on the lake that had been his city's cradle since the herons first showed his ancestors the eagle on the cactus. With him went his wife, and members of his household, and a handful of nobles who had chosen, at the very end, to go where he went. The lake by then was not the lake of the founding legend. It was a hunting ground, patrolled by 13 brigantines that Cortés had built for exactly this purpose, each one armed and low in the water and faster than any canoe could ever be. A commander named Garcia Holguin had that stretch of water under his watch, and it did not take him long to notice a single canoe moving with more urgency, more purpose, more concealment than the ordinary traffic of refugees. He gave chase. The canoe had no chance of outrunning a hull built and rigged by shipwrights, and Holguin's crew came alongside close enough to see that the man they had stopped was dressed, even now, in the manner of someone who intended to be recognized for who he was. He did not resist, and he did not deny his name. He asked, this much is recorded consistently enough across the Spanish accounts to be trusted in its substance, to be taken to Cortés himself, rather than handled by whoever happened to have caught him. And when he was brought before the conquistador later that same day, on a rooftop terrace overlooking what remained of the city both men had spent 2 years fighting over, Cuauhtémoc is said to have spoken with a composure that unsettled the Spaniards more than defiance would have. He placed his hand, in some tellings, on the dagger at Cortés's belt, and said that he had done everything a man could do to defend his city and his people, and that since he had failed, Cortés should take the weapon and end it now, because a captured king had no further use to give the world. It was not a plea. Benol Diaz, who was present and left the fullest eyewitness account of that afternoon, remembered it as the words of a man who still, somehow, in total defeat, retained the bearing of someone who ruled. Cortés did not kill him. He answered, through his interpreters, with something meant to sound like magnanimity, that he honored a brave enemy, that Cuauhtémoc would be treated as befit his rank. The siege was over in that moment, 80 days after it began, the last independent Nahua government in the valley extinguished not by a treaty or a formal surrender of arms but by one canoe, caught on open water, on an ordinary-looking morning in August. What waited for Cuauhtémoc afterward, what treated as befit his rank would actually come to mean, in the years the Spanish called peace, was not something anyone standing on that rooftop terrace could yet have guessed. The morning after would not have felt like morning to anyone still living inside the ruins. Smoke hung low over what had been the most beautiful city in the Western Hemisphere, and beneath the smoke lay something almost impossible to describe in the words available to the men who tried. Benol Diaz, decades later, writing in old age in Guatemala, said he could not convey it: the canals choked with bodies, the great causeways cratered and blackened, the temples that had risen white and red against the lake now roofless, scorched, half collapsed into their own foundations. Tenochtitlan, at the start of that year, had held perhaps 200,000 people, more than London, more than any city in Spain. By the time Cuauhtémoc's canoe was run down on the open water, whole quarters stood empty of the living, and the survivors who remained had spent weeks eating bark, brackish lake water, leather, whatever could not properly be called food at all. The chronicles that later tried to count the dead of the 80-day siege gave numbers that varied wildly and were probably all guesses, but even the most conservative of them describe a depopulation on a scale that has almost no parallel in the history of any single city, anywhere, in any century. And disease had done more of that work than Spanish steel ever could. The smallpox that swept through the valley in 1520, arriving with an infected soldier in Panfilo de Novaes' expedition, had already killed the Emperor Cuitlahuac and, by some estimates, a third of the basin of Mexico's population before the siege of Tenochtitlan even began. This is the part of the story that sits uneasily with any tale of conquest told only through captains and cannon, the truth that the deadliest weapon the Spanish carried into the valley was one neither side understood, invisible, carried in breath and touch, needing no army at all. Cortés did not defeat an empire at full strength. He walked into a civilization already reeling from a catastrophe with no precedent in its own memory, no name for it in Nahuatl until one was invented, and by the time his soldiers stood on the rubble of the Templo Mayor, the empire they had conquered had already been dying for a year by a cause no sword could touch. What Cortés built afterward, he built almost immediately, and he built it on the same ground. This detail is worth sitting with in the stillness of this last chapter, because it says something the rest of the story only gestures toward. He did not choose some fresh, unmarked stretch of shoreline for his new capital. He rebuilt directly on top of Tenochtitlan itself, the same island, the same causeways repaired and widened, the same grid of canals slowly filled or spanned by Spanish streets. Mexico City, to this day, sits on that foundation. The stones of the Templo Mayor, the twin pyramids of Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc that had crowned the old ceremonial precinct, were pulled down and used, this is not metaphor, it is simple bricklaying, as the foundation stones and wall fill of the new cathedral the Spanish raised barely a stone's throw from where the temple had stood. An empire's most sacred architecture became, quite literally, the substructure of the one that replaced it. If you have ever stood in the Zocalo in Mexico City, that vast stone plaza with the excavated ruins of the Templo Mayor now open to the sky just beside the cathedral, you have stood at the exact hinge point of everything this story has followed for the last 4 hours, one civilization built, without apology, on the bones of the one before it, the two never quite separable however hard later centuries tried to prise them apart. For a long time afterward, it seemed as though the voice of that older world might simply go silent. The conquest did not just take land and temples, it took the pictorial codices, burned by the hundreds in bonfires meant to erase a religion the friars considered demonic, and it took, more slowly and less dramatically, the confidence of an entire people to speak of what they had lost. But the silence was not total, and this is where the story finds its quiet, resolving thread. Decades after the fall of the city, a Franciscan friar named Bernardino de Sahagun did something almost nobody else in the Spanish colonial world thought to do. He sat down with elderly Nahua men, some of them old enough to have lived through the siege as children, or to have heard it firsthand from parents who had, and he asked them, patiently, over years, in their own language, what they remembered. Not what the Spanish account said. What they remembered. He trained Nahua scribes to write their answers in Nahuatl using the Latin alphabet, cross-referenced testimonies, revised drafts, and slowly assembled what became known as the Florentine Codex, thousands of pages, bound in 12 books, holding not just the Spanish version of the conquest but, folded inside it, the accounts of the people who had watched their own city die from the inside. It took another 400 years for the wider world to read those testimonies as their own story rather than as a footnote to someone else's. In the 20th century, a scholar named Miguel León Portilla gathered the Nahuatl voices out of Sahagun's manuscripts and other indigenous sources and published them together as a single narrative, given the English title The Broken Spears, a phrase drawn from one of the surviving Nahuatl laments, a poem written by someone who had stood in the wreckage and found, of all things, words for it. Broken spears lie in the roads, it says, we have torn our hair in grief. The houses are roofless now, and their walls are red with blood. It is not a war chronicle. It is a dirge, and it is also, quietly, an act of defiance, proof that the people the conquest was meant to erase had not, in fact, been erased, that they had watched, and grieved, and found a way, eventually, hundreds of years later, to be heard on their own terms. That is where this story rests, in the end, not with the fall of a temple or the capture of an emperor, but with the fact that someone, generations afterward, was still listening closely enough to write down what the losers remembered. Empires end. Cities burn and are rebuilt on their own ashes. But the memory of what a people were, spoken once in their own words and preserved, however imperfectly, outlasts the empire that tried to silence it. Tenochtitlan is gone. The lake it stood on has been drained for centuries, the canals filled, the causeways paved into wide modern avenues you could drive down without ever knowing what lies beneath the tarmac. And yet the words remain, low as embers under ash, still faintly warm if you know where to look for them. If the last night of Tenochtitlan kept you company through the dark, know that the lake still holds other stories beneath its silt, cities swallowed by fever and fire, empires that rose on water and slipped quietly under it. Let your eyes close now, the story is finished, and you are safe. If you'd like more evenings like this one, settle in and subscribe. New histories arrive to carry you toward sleep every week. Rest well. There are older, quieter worlds waiting for you tomorrow night.